Wa, Niem, Wezi, and others, so I soon became more or less acquainted with the habits of these tribes. The Swahili live principally along the coast of British East Africa and at Zanzibar. They are a mixed race, being the descendants of Arab fathers and Negro mothers. Their name is derived from the Arabic word Swahil, or coast, but it has also been said by some who have found them scarcely so guileless as might have been expected, to be really a corruption of the words Sawahili, that is, those who cheat all alike. However that may be, the men are as a rule of splendid physique and well qualified for the calling that the majority of them follow, that of caravan porters. They are a careless, light-hearted, improvident people, and are very fond of all the good things of this world, enjoying them thoroughly whenever they get the chance. Their life is spent in journeying to and from the interior, carrying heavy loads of provisions and trade goods on the one journey, and returning with similar loads of ivory or other products of the country. They are away for many months at a time on these expeditions, and consequently, as they cannot spend money on the march, they have a goodly number of rupees to draw on their return to Mombasa. These generally disappear with wonderful rapidity, and when no more fun can be bought, they join another caravan and begin a new safari to the Great Lakes, or even beyond. Many a time I have watched them trudging along the old caravan road, which crossed the Tsavo at a ford about half a mile from the railway station. Here a halt was always called, so that they might wash and bathe in the cool waters of the river. Nothing ever seems to damp the spirits of the Swahili porter. Be his life ever so hard, his load ever so heavy, the moment it is off his back and he has disposed of his pasho or food, he straightway forgets all his troubles, and begins to laugh and sing and joke with his fellows as if he were the happiest and luckiest mortal alive. Such was my cook, Mabruki, and his merry laugh was quite infectious. I remember that one day he was opening a tin of biscuits for me, and not being able to pull off the underlid with his fingers, he seized the flap in his magnificent teeth and tugged at it. I shouted to him to stop, thinking that he might break a tooth, but he misunderstood my solicitude and gravely assured me that he would not spoil the tin. The Swahili men wear a long white cotton garment, like a nightshirt, called a kanzu. The women, who are too liberally endowed to be entirely graceful, go about with bare arms and shoulders, and wear a long, brightly colored cloth, which they wind tightly around their bosoms, then allow to fall to the feet. All are followers of the Prophet, and their social customs are consequently much the same as those of any other Mohammedan race, though with a good admixture of savagedom. They have a happy knack of giving a nickname to every European with whom they have to do, such nickname generally making reference to something peculiar or striking in his habits, temper, or appearance. On the whole, they are kindly, generous folk, whom one cannot help liking. Of the many tribes which are to be seen about the railway on the way up from the coast, perhaps the most extraordinary looking are the Wa Nyika, the people who inhabit the thorny Nyika or wilderness which borders on the Taru Desert. They are exceedingly ugly and of a low type. The men wear nothing in the way of dress, but a scanty and very dirty cloth thrown over their shoulders, while the women attire themselves only in a short kilt, which is tied round them very low at the waist. Both men and women adorn themselves with brass chains round the neck and coils of copper and iron wire around the arms. The nearest native inhabitants of Tsavo are the Wa Taita, who dwell in the mountains near Ndi, some 30 miles away. My work often took me to this place, and on one of my visits, finding myself with some spare time on my hands, I set out to pay a long-promised visit to the district officer. A fairly good road ran from Ndi station to his house at the foot of the mountains, about 4 miles away, and on my arrival I was not only most hospitably entertained, but was also introduced to Mgogo, the head chief of the Wa Taita, who had just come in from a showery or consultation about some affair of state. The old fellow appeared delighted to meet me, and promptly invited me to his kraal, some way up the hills. I jumped at the prospect of seeing the Wa Taita at home, so presently off we started on our heavy climb, my Indian servant Bwa Wal coming with us. After a couple of hours' steady scramble up a steep and slippery goat path, we arrived at Mgogo's capital, where I was at once introduced to his wives, who were busily engaged in making pombe, a native fermented drink, in a hollowed-out stump of a tree. I presented one of them with an orange for her child, but she did not understand what it was for. On tasting it, she made a very wry face and would not eat it. Still, she did not throw it away, but carefully put it into a bag with her other treasures, doubtless for future investigation. As soon as the women saw Bawal, however, he became the center of attraction, and I was eclipsed. He happened to have on a new puggaree with lots of gold work on it, and this took their fancy immensely. They examined every last line most carefully and went into ecstasies over it, just as their European sisters would have done over the latest Parisian creation. We made a short halt for rest and refreshment, and then started again on our journey to the top of the hills. After a stiff climb for another 2 hours, part of it through a thick black forest, we emerged on the summit, where I found I was well rewarded for my trouble by the magnificent views we obtained on all sides. The great Kilimanjaro stood out particularly well and made a very effective background to the fine panorama. I was surprised to find a number of well-fed cattle on the mountain top, but I fancy Mgogo thought I was casting an evil spell over them when he saw me taking photographs of them as they grazed peacefully on the sweet grass which covered the plateau. Like most other natives of Africa, the Waitaita are exceedingly superstitious, and this feeling is turned to good account by the all-powerful witch doctor or medicine man. It is, for instance, an extraordinary sight to see the absolute faith with which the Ka-ki-taita will blow the Simbwa dawa, or lion medicine, to the 4 points of the compass before lying down to sleep in the open. This dawa, which is of course obtainable only from the witch doctor, consists simply of a little black powder, usually carried in a tiny horn stuck through a slit in the ear. But the Ki-taita firmly believes that a few grains of this dust blown round him from the palm of the hand is a complete safeguard against raging lions seeking whom they may devour. And after the blowing ceremony he will lie down to sleep in perfect confidence, even in the midst of a man-eater's district. In the nature of things, moreover, he never loses his touching faith in the efficacy of the witch doctor's charm, for if he is attacked by a lion, the brute sees to it that he does not live to become an unbeliever, while if he is not attacked, it is of course quite clear that it is to the dawa that he owes his immunity. For the rest, the Waitaita are essentially a peace-loving and industrious people, and indeed, before the arrival of the British in the country, they hardly ever ventured down from their mountain fastnesses, owing to their dread of the warlike Maasai. Each man has as many wives as he can afford to pay for in sheep or cattle. He provides each spouse with a separate establishment, but the family huts are clustered together, and as a rule all live in perfect harmony. The most curious custom of the tribe is the filing of the front teeth into sharp points, which gives the whole face a most peculiar and rather diabolical expression. As usual, their ideas of costume are rather primitive. The men sometimes wear a scrap of cloth round the loins, while the women content themselves with the same or with a short kilt. Both sexes adorn themselves with a great quantity of copper or iron wire coiled round their arms and legs, and smear their bodies all over with grease, the men adding red clay to the mixture. Many of the women also wear dozens of rows of beads, while their ears are hung with pieces of chain and other fantastic ornaments. The men always carry bows and poisoned arrows, as well as a simi, a short, roughly fashioned sword, hung on a leathern thong around the waist. A three-legged stool is also an important part of their equipment, and is slung on the shoulder when on the march. The next people met with on the road to the Great Lakes are the Wakamba, who inhabit the Ukambani province, and may be seen from Mtoto Ande to the Athi River. They are a very large tribe, but have very little cohesion, having split up into many clans under chiefs who govern in a patriarchal kind of way. In appearance and dress, or the want of it, they are very like the Waitaita, and they have the same custom of filing the front teeth. As a rule, too, they are a peace-loving people, though when driven to it by hunger they will commit very cruel and treacherous acts of wholesale murder. While the railway was being constructed, a severe famine occurred in their part of the country, when hundreds of them died of starvation. During this period, they several times swooped down on an isolated railway maintenance gang and utterly annihilated them, in order to obtain possession of the food which they knew would be stored in the camps. These attacks were always made by night. Like most other native races in East Africa, their only arms are the bow and poisoned arrow, but in the use of these primitive weapons they are especially expert. The arrowhead remains in the flesh when the shaft is withdrawn, and if the poison is fresh, paralysis and death very quickly follow, the skin round the wound turning yellow and mortifying within an hour or two. This deadly poison is obtained, I believe, by boiling down a particular root, the arrowheads being dipped in the black, pitchy-looking essence which remains. I am glad to say, however, that owing to the establishment of several mission stations amongst them, the Wakamba are quickly becoming the most civilized natives in the country, and the missionaries have adopted the sensible course of teaching the people husbandry and the practical arts and crafts of everyday life, in addition to caring for their spiritual needs. After Hippo. During my stay at Tsavo, I made many little excursions into the surrounding country and used to go off on a short shooting and exploring expedition whenever I had the opportunity. I was especially anxious to bag a hippopotamus, so I made up my mind to try my luck on the banks of the Sabaki. Unfortunately, I possessed no heavy rifle, which is almost a necessity for hippo shooting, but it occurred to me to supply the deficiency by manufacturing a few cartridges for my own smoothbore. In these I had double charges of powder and a hardened bullet made of lead mixed with about an eighth part of tin. I remember well the anxiety with which I fired the first round of my homemade ammunition. As I more than half expected that the barrel would burst, I lashed the gun in the fork of a tree, tied a piece of string 100 feet long to the trigger, and then, taking shelter behind a friendly stump, pulled off. To my great satisfaction, the barrel stood the test perfectly. More than that, on trying the penetrative effect of my bullets, I found that they would smash through a steel plate an eighth of an inch thick at 30 yards range. This was quite good enough for my purpose and gave me great confidence in the weapon. All the same time, I had a very narrow escape one day while manufacturing some of this ammunition. My plan was to remove the shot from the cartridge, put in the additional powder, and ram this well in before replacing the wad and putting in the bullet. I had clamped my refilling machine to my rough-hewn table and was stamping the double charge of powder well down into the cartridge, when suddenly, for some unknown reason, the whole charge exploded right into my face. Everything became pitch dark to me, and I groped my way about the little hut in agony of mind as well as body, for I thought I had been blinded. I am thankful to say, however, that gleams of light soon began to return to my eyes, and in a few hours' time I was almost all right again, and able to go on with my cartridge making. All my preparations having been made, I set out for the Sabaki, taking with me my Indian gun-bearer Mahina, my cook Mabruki, a beastie or water carrier, and a couple of natives to carry our odds and ends. On these occasions I usually took no tent, but bivouacked in the open. We took some bread and a few tinned provisions with us, but I always could depend upon getting a paa, guinea fowl, partridge, or rock rabbit for the larder on the march. These rock rabbits are more like big rats than rabbits, and are found in great numbers among the rocks along the banks of the rivers. They are not at all bad eating, but the Swahili will not touch them. They call them tupu, or shameless naked things, owing to their lack of a tail, of which indeed they possess not even a vestige. Our route lay by the always interesting Tsavo River. Along the banks, everything within reach of its moisture is delightfully fresh and green. Palms and other trees, festooned with brilliant flowering creepers, flourish along its course. All kinds of monkeys chatter and jabber in the shade overhead as they swing themselves from branch to branch, while birds of the most gorgeous plumage flutter about, giving a very tropical aspect to the scene. On the other hand, if one is tempted to stray away from the river, be it only for a few yards, one comes immediately into the parched, thorny wilderness of stunted, leafless trees. Here the sun beats down pitilessly and makes the Nyika of the Tsavo Valley almost intolerable. The river has its source at the foot of snow-crowned Kilimanjaro, whence it flows for about 80 miles in a northerly direction until it joins the Athi River about 7 miles below Tsavo Station. From this point, the united streams take the name of Sabaki and flow more or less eastwards until they reach the Indian Ocean at Malindi, some 70 miles north of Mombasa. A narrow and tortuous Maasai warpath winds along its whole length, but although we followed this trail, our journey was nevertheless a very slow one, owing to the overhanging branches and creepers, from which we had constantly to be disengaged. The march was full of interest, however, for it was not long before we came upon fresh tracks of both hippo and rhino. Every now and again also we got glimpses of startled bush buck and water buck, while occasionally the sound of a splash in the water told of a very wary crocodile. We had gone about half the distance to the Sabaki when we came upon an unexpected obstacle in the shape of a great ridge of barren, rugged rock about 100 feet high, which extended for about a mile or so on both banks of the river. The sides of this gorge went sheer down into the water, and were quite impossible to scale. I therefore determined to make a detour around it, but Mahina was confident that he could walk along in the river itself. I hinted mildly at the possibility of there being crocodiles under the rocky ledges. Mahina declared, however, that there was no danger, and making a bundle of his lower garments, he tied it to his back and stepped into the water. For a few minutes all went well. Then, in an instant, he was lifted right off his feet by the rush of the water and whirled away. The river took a sharp bend in this gorge, and he was rounded and out of our sight in no time, the last glimpse we caught of him showing him vainly trying to catch hold of an overhanging branch. Although we at once made all the haste we could to get round the ridge of rocks, it took us nearly a half an hour to do it. I had almost given up hope of ever seeing Mahina again, and was much relieved, therefore, when we reached the riverside once more, to find him safe and sound, and a little the worse for his adventure. Luckily he had been dashed up against a rushy bank, and had managed to scramble out with no more serious damage than a bruised shin. Eventually we arrived at the junction of the rivers and proceeded some way down the Sabaki, beside which the Tsavo looks very insignificant. Several islands are dotted about in midstream and are overgrown with tall reeds and rushes, in which hippo find capital covert all year round. As with the Tsavo, the banks of the Sabaki are lined with trees of various kinds, affording most welcome shade from the heat of the sun, and skirting the river is a caravan road from the interior, still used, I believe, for smuggling slaves and ivory to the coast, where dhows are in readiness to convey them to Persia or Arabia. After an early dinner, which Mabruki soon got ready, I left my followers encamped in the safe boma a mile away from the river, and started out with Mahina to find a suitable tree near a hippo run, in which to spend the night. Having some difficulty in finding a likely spot, we crossed to the other side of the river, rather a risky thing to do on account of the number of crocodiles in it. We found a fairly shallow ford, however, and managed to get safely over. Here, on what was evidently an island during flood time, we found innumerable traces of both hippo and rhino. In fact, the difficulty was to decide which track was the best and freshest. At length I picked out a tree close to the river, and commanding a stretch of sand which was all flattened down and looked as if at least one hippo rolled there regularly overnight. As there was still about an hour before sundown, we did not take up our station at once, but proceeded along the bank to see if any other game was about. We had not gone very far from Mahina, who was a little way ahead, signaled to me, and on joining him I saw a splendid-looking waterbuck standing in a shallow pool of the river. It was the first time I had seen one of these fine antelope, and I was delighted with the sight. I might have got 20 yards or so nearer, but I thought I had better not risk moving, so I aimed at the shoulder and fired. The buck gave one leap into the air, and then turned and galloped quickly behind an island which completely hid him from view. We waited for him to clear the rushes at the other end of this island, but as he did not appear, I got impatient and plunged into the river, regardless of crocodiles or anything else. On rounding the island, however, he was nowhere to be seen, and had evidently turned off while in the shelter of the reeds, and so gained the opposite bank. I was keenly disappointed at my failure, for it was impossible to follow him up. To do so, we should have had to make a long detour to get across the river, and by that time darkness would have set in. This incident shows the great drawback to the 30-30, namely, that it has a very little knockdown effect unless it strikes a vital part, and even then, in a bush country, an animal may manage to go far enough to be lost. On the other hand, an animal wounded with a hard bullet is likely to make a speedy recovery, which is a great blessing. Mahina was even more upset at the escape of the buck than I was, and as we trudged back through the sand to our tree, he was full of gloomy forebodings of an unlucky night. By the light of a splendid full moon, we settled ourselves on a great outspreading branch and commenced our vigil. Soon the jungle around us began to be alive with its peculiar sounds. A night bird would call, a crocodile shut his jaws with a snap, a rhino or hippo crashed through the bushes on its way to the water. Now and again we would even hear the distant roar of the lion. Still there was nothing to be seen. After waiting for some considerable time, a great hippo at last made his appearance and came splashing along in our direction, but unfortunately took up his position behind a tree which, in the most tantalizing way, completely hid him from our view. Here he stood tooting and snorting and splashing about to his heart's content. For what seemed hours I watched for this ungainly creature to emerge from his covert, but as he seemed determined not to show himself, I lost patience and made up my mind to go down after him. I therefore handed my rifle to Mahina to lower to me on reaching the ground, and began to descend carefully, holding on by the creepers which encircled the tree. To my intense vexation and disappointment, just as I was in this helpless condition, halfway to the ground, the great hippo suddenly came out from his shelter and calmly lumbered along right underneath me. I bitterly lamented my ill luck and want of patience, for I could almost have touched his broad back as he passed. It was under these exasperating conditions that I saw a hippo for the first time, and without doubt he is the ugliest and most forbidding-looking brute I have ever beheld. The moment the great beast had passed our tree, he scented us, snorted loudly, and dived into the bushes close by, smashing through them like a traction engine. In screwing myself round to watch him go, I broke the creepers by which I was holding on and landed on my back in the sand at the foot of the tree, none the worse for my short drop, but considerably startled at the thought that the hippo might come back at any moment. I climbed up to my perch again without loss of time, but he was evidently as much frightened as I was, and returned no more. Shortly after this we saw 2 rhino come down to the river to drink. They were too far off for a shot, however, so I did not disturb them, and they gradually waddled upstream out of sight. Then we heard the awe-inspiring roar of a hungry lion close by, and presently another hippo gave forth his tooting challenge a little way down the river. As there seemed no likelihood of getting a shot at him from our tree, I made up my mind to stalk him on foot, so we both descended from our perch and made our way slowly through the trees in the semi-darkness. There were numbers of animals about, and I'm sure that neither of us felt very comfortable as we crept along in the direction of the splashing hippo. For my own part, I fancied every moment that I saw in front of me the form of a rhino or a lion ready to charge down upon us out of the shadow of the bush. In this manner, with nerves strung to the highest pitch, we reached the edge of the river in safety, only to find that we were again balked by a small rush-covered island, on the other side of which our quarry could be heard. There was a good breeze blowing directly from him, however, so I thought the best thing to do was to attempt to get onto the island and have a shot at him from there. Mahina, too, was eager for the fray, so we let ourselves quietly in the water, which here was quite shallow and reached only to our knees, and waded slowly across. On peering cautiously through the reeds at the corner of the island, I was surprised to find that I could see nothing of the hippo, but I soon realized that I was looking too far ahead, for on lowering my eyes there he was, not 25 yards away, lying down in the shallow water, only half covered and practically facing us. His closeness to us made me rather anxious for our safety, more especially as just then he rose to his feet and gave forth the particular challenge or call which we had already heard so often during the night. All the same, as he raised his head, I fired at it. He whirled round, made a plunge forward, staggered and fell, then lay quite still. To make assurance doubly sure, I gave him a couple more bullets as he lay, but we found afterwards that they were not needed, as my first shot had been a very lucky one and had penetrated the brain. We left him where he fell and got back to our perch, glad and relieved to be in safety once more. As soon as it was daylight, we were joined by my own men and by several Wakamba who had been hunting in the neighborhood. The natives cut out the tusks of the hippo, which were rather good ones, and feasted ravenously on the flesh, while I turned my attention with gratitude to the hot coffee and cakes which Mabruki had meanwhile prepared. Chapter 13. A Day on the Ndungu Escarpment. Immediately after breakfast, camp was struck, and accompanied by a few of the Wakamba, we started off for the Ndungu Escarpment, a frowning ridge which runs for a great distance parallel to the Sabaki, some 3 or 4 miles from its northern bank. We had not gone very far before I caught sight of a fine waterbuck and successfully bowled him over, a good omen for the day, which put us all in excellent spirits. Mabruki cut off several strips of the tough meat and impaled them on a sharp stick to dry in the sun as he went along. I warned him that he had better be careful that a lion did not scent the meat, as if it did, it would be sure to follow up and kill him. Of course I did not mean this seriously, but Mabruki was a great glutton and by no means courageous, so I wanted to frighten him. As we trudged along towards the hill, I heard a peculiar noise behind a small rising on our right, and looking over the crest, I was delighted to see 2 beautiful giraffes feeding peacefully a little distance away and straining their long necks to get at the tops of some mimosa-like trees, while a young one was lying down in the grass quite close to me. For some time I remained concealed, watching the full-grown pair with great interest. They had evidently just come up from the river and were slowly making their way back to their home on the escarpment. They seemed on the most affectionate terms, occasionally entwining their great long necks and gently biting each other on the shoulders. Much as I should like to have added a giraffe to my collection of trophies, I left them undisturbed, as I think it a pity to shoot those rather rare and very harmless creatures, unless one is required for a special purpose. We pushed on, accordingly, towards the escarpment, for I was very impatient to get to the top and explore a place where I felt convinced no other white man had ever set foot. From the river, the ground rose gently upwards to the foot of the ridge, and was covered more or less densely with stunted trees and brushes, and of course the inevitable wait-a-bit thorns. I was fortunate enough, however, to find a rhino path which afforded a fairly comfortable and open road, on which we could walk upright the greater part of the way. The climb up the escarpment was a stiff one, and had to be negotiated principally on all fours, but on the way up I discovered that there was an enormous cleft some miles to the right, which would probably have afforded an easier ascent. I had not time to explore it on this particular day, but I made a mental note to do so on some future occasion. After 2 hours' journey from the river, we sat panting on the summit after our scramble and surveyed the valley of the Tsavo, which lay spread out like a map about 500 feet below us. Our home tents, the bridge, Tsavo station, and other buildings were plainly visible, and the railway itself, like a shining snake, could be seen for many miles winding its way through the parched wilderness. Having taken a few photographs of the scene, we turned and struck through the Ndungo Plateau. Here I found the same kind of nyika as that round Tsavo, the only difference being that there were more green trees about. The country, moreover, was somewhat more open, and was intersected by hundreds of broad and well-beaten animal paths, along which we could walk upright in comfort. I was leading the way, followed closely by Mahina and Mabruki, when suddenly we almost walked upon a lion which was lying down at the side of the path, and which had probably been asleep. It gave a fierce growl, and at once bounded off through the bush. But to Mabruki, who doubtless recalled then the warning I had given him in fun earlier in the day, the incident appeared so alarming that he flung down his stick-load of meat and fled for his life, much to the amusement of the others, even the usually silent Wakamba joining in the general laughter as they scrambled for the discarded meat. We saw nothing more of the lion, though a few steps further on brought us to the remains of a zebra which he had recently killed and feasted on. But after this, Mabruki kept carefully in the rear. Curiously enough, only a short while later we had an exactly similar adventure with a rhino, as owing to the tortuous nature of the path, we walked right into it before we were aware. Like the lion, however, it was more frightened than we, and charged away from us through the jungle. For about 2 hours we pursued our journey into the plateau, and saw and heard a wonderful variety of game, including giraffe, rhino, bushbuck, the lesser kudu, zebra, warthog, baboons, and monkeys, and any number of pa'a, the last being of a redder color than those of the Tsavo Valley. Of natives or of human habitations, however, we saw no signs, and indeed the whole region was so dry and waterless as to be quite uninhabitable. The animals that require water have to make a lengthy nightly journey to and from the Sabaki, which accounts for the thousands of animal paths leading from the plateau to the river. By this time we were all beginning to feel very tired, and the Bisti's stock of water was running low. I therefore climbed the highest tree I could find in order to have a good look around, but absolutely nothing could I see in any direction but the same flat, thorny wilderness, interspersed here and there with a few green trees. Not a landmark of any sort or kind as far as the eye could reach. A most hopeless, terrible place should one be lost in it, with certain death either by thirst or by savage beasts staring one in the face. Clearly, then, the only thing to do was to return to the river, and in order to accomplish this before dark, it was necessary that no time should be lost. But we had been winding in and out so much through the animal paths that it was no easy matter to say in which direction the Sabaki lay. First I consulted my Wakamba followers as to the route back. They simply shook their heads. Then I asked Mahina, who pointed out a direction exactly opposite to that which I felt confident was the right one. Mabruki, of course, knew nothing, but volunteered the helpful and cheering information that we were lost and would all be killed by lions. In these circumstances, I confirmed my own ideas to our way by comparing my watch and the sun, and gave the order to start at once. For 2 solid hours, however, we trudged along in the fearful heat without striking a single familiar object or landmark. Mabruki murmured loudly. Even Mahina expressed grave doubts as to whether the Sahib had taken the right direction. Only the Wakamba stalked along in reassuring silence. For some time we had been following a broad white rhino path, and the great footmarks of one of these beasts were fresh and plainly visible in the dust. He had been traveling in the opposite direction to us, and I felt sure that he must have been returning from drinking in the river. I accordingly insisted on keeping to this path, and very soon, to my great relief, we found that we were at the edge of the escarpment, a couple of miles away from the place where we had made the ascent. Here a halt was called. A sheet was spread over some of the stunted trees, and under its shade we rested for a half an hour, had some food, and drank the last of our water. After this, we pushed on with renewed vigor and arrived at the Sabaki in good time before sundown, having bagged a couple of guinea fowl and a pa'a on the way to serve for dinner. After the long and fatiguing day, my bath in a clear, shady pool was a real delight, but I might not have enjoyed it quite so much if I had known then of the terrible fate which awaited one of my followers in the same river the next day. By the time I got back to camp, supper was ready and fully appreciated. The tireless Mahina had also collected some dry grass for my bed, and I turned in at once, with my rifle handy, and slept the sleep of the just, regardless of all the wild beasts in Africa. At dawn, Mabruki roused me with a cup of steaming hot coffee and some biscuits, and a start was at once made on our return journey to Tsavo. The place where we had struck the Sabaki the previous evening was some miles further down the stream than I had ever been before, so I decided to take advantage of the Maasai Trail along its bank until the Tsavo River was reached. I did not think we should meet with any further adventure on our way home, but in the wilds the unexpected is always happening. Shortly after we started, one of the Wakamba went down to the river's edge to fill his calabash with water, when a crocodile suddenly rose up out of the stream, seized the poor fellow, and in a moment had dragged him in. I was on ahead at the time, and so did not witness the occurrence, but on hearing the cries of the others, I ran back as quickly as possible. Too late, however, to see any sign of either crocodile or native. Mahina philosophically remarked that after all it was only a Washenzi or savage, whose loss did not much matter, and the other three Wakamba certainly did not appear to be affected by the incident, but calmly possessed themselves of their dead companion's bow and quiver of poisoned arrows, and of the stock of meat which he had left on the bank. I have since learned that accidents of this kind are fairly frequent occurrence along the banks of these rivers. On one occasion, while I was in the country, a British officer had a very lucky escape. He was filling his water bottle at the river when one of these brutes caught him by the hand and attempted to draw him in. Fortunately, one of his servants rushed to his assistance and managed to pull him out of the crocodile's clutches with the loss of only 2 of his fingers. As we made our way up the Sabaki, we discovered a beautiful waterfall about 150 feet high, not a sheer drop, but a series of cascades. At this time the river was in low water, and the falls consequently did not look their best, but in flood time they form a fine sight, and the thunder of the falling water can be plainly heard at Tsavo, over 7 miles away. When the wind is in the right direction, we crossed the river on the rocks at the head of these falls, and after some hours' hard marching, reached camp without further incident. Chapter 14. The Finding of the Man-Eater's Den. There were some rocky-looking hills lying to the southwest of Tsavo, which I was particularly anxious to explore, so on one occasion when work had been stopped for the day owing to a lack of material, I set off for them, accompanied by Mahina and a Punjabi coolie, who was so stout that he went by the name of Mutta, or Fatty. In the course of my little excursions around Tsavo, I gradually discovered that I was nearly always able to make my way to any required point of the compass by following certain well-defined animal paths, which I mapped out bit by bit during my explorations. On this occasion, for instance, as soon as we had crossed the river and had struck into the jungle, we were fortunate enough to find a rhino path leading in the right direction, which greatly facilitated our progress. As we were making our way along this path through the dry bed of Nulla, I happened to notice that the sandy bottom sparkled here and there where the sunbeams penetrated the dense foliage. This at once filled my head with thoughts of precious stones. As the spot looked likely enough, I started to dig vigorously at the gravel with my hunting knife. After a few minutes of this work, I came across what I first took to be a magnificent diamond sparkling in the damp sand. It was about a half-inch long, and its facets looked as if they had been cut by an Amsterdam expert. I tested the stone on my watch glass and found that it cut my initials quite easily, and though I knew that quartz would do this as well, it did not seem to me to have either the general appearance or angles of any quartz I had ever seen. For a moment or two I was greatly delighted with my discovery, and began to have rosy dreams of a diamond mine, but I'm sorry to say that on closer examination and testing, I was forced to the conclusion that my find was not a diamond, though unlike any other mineral I had ever come across. My hopes of rapidly becoming a millionaire having thus been dashed to the ground, we proceeded on our way, getting further and further into the depths of a gloomy forest. A little distance on, I noticed through a break in the trees a huge rhino standing in full view near the edge of a ravine. Unfortunately, he caught sight of us as well, and before I could take aim, he snorted loudly and crashed off through the tangled undergrowth. As I followed up this ravine, walking stealthily along in the delightful shade of the overhanging palms, I observed on my left a little nullah which opened out of the main channel through a confused mass of jungle and creeper. Through this tangle there was a well-defined archway, doubtless made by the regular passage of rhino and hippo, so I decided to enter and explore what lay beyond. I had not gone very far when I came upon a big bay scooped out of the bank by the stream when in flood and carpeted with a deposit of fine, soft sand, in which were the indistinct tracks of numberless animals. In one corner of this bay, close under an overhanging tree, stood a little sandy hillock, and on looking over the top of this I saw on the other side a fearsome-looking cave, which seemed to run back for a considerable distance under the rocky bank. Round the entrance and inside the cavern I was thunderstruck to find a number of human bones, with here and there a copper bangle such as the natives wear. Beyond all doubt, the man-eater's den. In this manner, and quite by accident, I stumbled upon the lair of these once dreaded demons, which I had spent so many days searching for through the exasperating and interminable jungle during the time when they terrorized Tsavo. I had no inclination to explore the gloomy depths of the interior, but thinking that there might possibly still be a lioness or cub inside, I fired a shot or two into the cavern through a hole in the roof. Save for a swarm of bats, nothing came out, and after taking a photograph of the cave, I gladly left the horrible spot, thankful that the savage and insatiable brutes which once inhabited it were no longer at large. Retracing my steps to the main ravine, I continued my journey along it. After a little while I fancied I saw a hippo among some tall rushes growing on a bank, and quickly signed to Mahina and Muta to stay perfectly still. I then made a careful stalk, only to discover, after all my trouble, that my eyes had deceived me and made me imagine a black bank and a few rushes to be a living animal. We now left the bed of the ravine and advanced along the top. This turned out to be a good move, for soon we heard the galloping of a herd of some animal or other across our front. I rushed around a corner in the path a few yards ahead, and crouching under the bushes saw a line of startled zebras flying past. This was the first time I had seen these beautifully marked animals in their wild state, so I selected the largest and fired, and I was quite close to them. He dropped in his tracks stone dead. When I stood over the handsome creature, I was positively sorry for having killed him. Not so Muta, however, who rushed up in ecstasy, and before I could stop him had cut his throat. This was done, as he remarked, to make the meat lawful, for Muta was a devout follower of the Prophet, and no true Mohammedan will eat the flesh of any animal unless the throat has been cut at the proper place and the blood allowed to flow. This custom has often caused me great annoyance, for Mohammedan followers rush in so quickly when an animal is shot and cut the head off so short that it is afterwards quite useless as a trophy. By the time the zebra was skinned, darkness was fast approaching, so we selected a suitable tree in which to pass the night. Under it we built a goodly fire, made some tea, and roasted a couple of quails which I had shot early in the day, and which proved delicious. When we betook ourselves to the branches, at least Mahina and I did, Muta was afraid of nothing, and said he would sleep on the ground. He was not so full of courage later on, however, for about midnight a great rhino passed our way, winded us, and snorted so loudly that Muta scrambled in abject terror up our tree. He was as nimble as a monkey, for all his stoutness, and never ceased climbing until he was far above us. We both laughed heartily at his extraordinary haste to get out of danger, and Mahina chaffed him unmercifully. The rest of the night passed without incident, and in the early morning, while the boys were preparing breakfast, I strolled off towards the rocky hills which I had seen from Tsavo, which were now only about a half-mile distance. I kept a sharp lookout for game, but came across nothing save here and there a pa'a and a few guinea fowl, until, just as I was about halfway round the hill, I saw a fine leopard lying on a rocky ledge, basking in the morning sun. But he was too quick for me, and made off before I could get a shot. I had not approached noiselessly enough, and a leopard is too wary a beast to be caught napping. Unfortunately, I had no more time at my disposal in which to explore these hills, as I was anxious to resume work at Tsavo as soon as possible. So after breakfast we packed up the zebra skin and began to retrace our steps through the jungle. It was an intensely hot day, and we were all very glad when at length we reached the home camp. Most of my little trips of this sort, however, were made in a northerly direction, towards the ever-interesting Athi or Sabaki rivers. After a long and tiring walk through the jungle, what a pleasure it was to lie up in the friendly shelter of the rushes which lined the banks, and watch the animals come down to drink, all unconscious of my presence. I took several photographs of scenes of this kind, but unfortunately many of the negatives were spoiled. Often, too, on a brilliant moonlight night, I have sat on a rock out in the middle of the stream, near a favorite drinking place, waiting for a shot at whatever fortune might send my way. How exasperating it was when the wind changed at the critical moment and gave me away to the rhino or other animal I had sat there for hours patiently awaiting. Occasionally I would get heartily tired of my weary vigil and wade across shore through the warm water to make my bed in the soft sand, regardless of the snap-snap of the crocodiles, which could plainly be heard from the deeper pools up and down the river. At the time, being new to the country, I did not realize the risks I ran, but later on, after my poor Wakamba follower had been seized and dragged under, as I have already described, I learned to be much more cautious. The shortest way of reaching the Athi River from Tsavo was to strike through the jungle in a northwesterly direction, and here there was luckily a particularly well-defined rhino path, which I always made use of. I discovered it quite by accident on one occasion when I asked some guests who were staying with me at Tsavo to spend a night on the banks of the river. As we were making our way slowly and painfully through the dense jungle, I came across this well-trodden path, which appeared to lead in the direction which I wished to go, and as I felt convinced at any rate it would bring us to the river somehow, I followed it with confidence. Our progress was now easy, and the track led through fairly open glades where traces of bushbuck and waterbuck were numerous. Indeed, once or twice we caught glimpses of these animals as they bounded away to the shelter of the thicket, warned by the sound of our approach. In the end, as I anticipated, the old rhino path proved a true guide, for it struck the Athi at an ideal spot for a camping ground, where some lofty trees close to the bank of the river gave a most grateful and refreshing shade. We had a delightful picnic, and my guests greatly enjoyed their night in the open, although one of them got rather a bad fright from a rhino, which suddenly snorted close to our camp, evidently very annoyed at our intrusion on his domain. In the morning they went off as soon as it was light to try their luck along the river, while I remained in camp to see to breakfast. After an hour or more, however, they all returned, empty-handed but very hungry, so when they had settled down to rest after a hearty meal, I thought I would sally forth and see if I could not meet with better success. I had gone only a short distance up the right bank of the river when I thought I observed a movement among the bushes ahead of me. On the alert, I stopped instantly, and the next moment was rewarded by seeing a splendid bushbuck advance from the water in a most stately manner. I could only make out his head and neck above the undergrowth, but as he was only some 50 yards off, I raised my rifle to my shoulder to fire. This movement at once caught his eye, and for the fraction of a second he stopped to gaze at me, thus giving me time to aim at where I supposed his shoulder to be. When I fired, he disappeared so suddenly and so completely that I felt sure that I had missed him and that he had made off through the bush. I therefore reloaded and advanced carefully with the intention of following up his trail, but to my unbounded delight, I came upon the buck, stretched out dead in his tracks, with my bullet through his heart. I lost no time in getting back to camp, the antelope swinging by his feet from a branch borne by two sturdy coolies, and my unlucky friends were very much astonished when they saw the fine bag I had secured in so short a time. The animal was soon skinned and furnished us with a delicious roast for lunch, and in the cool of the evening we made our way back to Tsavo without further adventure. Some little time after this, while one of these same friends, Mr. C. Rawson, happened to be again at Tsavo, we were sitting after dark under the veranda of my hut. I wanted something from my tent and set me and my Indian chowkidar to fetch it. He was going off in the dark to do so, when I called him back and told him to take a lantern for fear of snakes. This he did, and as soon as he got to the door of the tent, which was only a dozen yards off, he called out frantically, "Ar Sahib, Burra Samp Hai. Oh, master, there is a big snake here." "Where?" I shouted. "Here by the bed," he cried. "Bring the gun quickly." I seized the shotgun, which I have always kept handy, and rushed to the tent where, by the light of the lantern, I saw a great red snake, about 7 feet long, gazing at me from the side of my camp bed. I instantly fired at him, cutting him clean in half with a shot. The tail part remained where it was, but the head half quickly wriggled off and disappeared in the gloom of the tent. The trail of blood, however, enabled us to track it, and we eventually found the snake, still full of fight, under the edge of the ground sheet. He made a last vicious dart at one of the men who had run up, but was quickly given the happy dispatch by a blow on the head. Rawson now picked it up and brought it to the light. He then put his foot on the back of its head and with a stick forced open the jaws, when suddenly we saw two perfectly clear jets of poison spurt out from the fangs. An Indian babu or clerk, who happened to be standing near, got the full benefit of this, and the poor man was so panic-stricken that in a second he had torn off every atom of his clothing. We were very much amused by this, as of course we knew that although the poison was exceedingly venomous, it could do no harm unless it penetrated a cut or open wound in the flesh. I never found out the name of the snake, which, as I have said, was of a dark brick-red color all over, and I only saw one other of the same kind all the time I was in East Africa. I came upon it suddenly one day when out shooting. It was evidently much startled and stood erect, hissing venomously, but I also was so much taken aback at its appearance that I did not think about shooting it until it had glided off and disappeared in the thick undergrowth. Chapter 15. Unsuccessful Rhino Hunts. Although the jungle around Tsavo was a network of rhino paths, I had never so far been successful in my efforts to obtain one of these animals, nor was my ambition yet to be realized. One day I was out exploring in the dense bush, some 6 or 7 miles away from camp, and found my progress more than usually slow, owing to the fact that I had to spend most of my time crawling on all fours through the jungle. I was very pleased, therefore, to emerge suddenly on a broad and well-beaten track, along which I could walk comfortably in an upright position. In this were some fresh rhino footprints, which seemed barely an hour old, so I determined to follow them up. The roadway was beaten in places into a fine white dust by the passage of many heavy animals, and as I pushed cautiously forward, I fully expected to come face to face with a rhino at every corner I turned. After having gone a little way, I fancied that I really did see one lying at the foot of a tree some distance ahead of me, but on approaching cautiously found that it was nothing more than a great brown heap of loose earth which one of the huge beasts had raised by rolling about on the soft ground. This, however, was evidently a resting place, which was regularly used, so I made up my mind to spend a night in the overhanging branches of the tree. The next afternoon, accordingly, Mahina and I made our way back to the place, and by dusk we were safely but uncomfortably perched along the branches directly over the path. We had scarcely been there an hour, when to our delight we heard a great rhino plodding along the track in our direction. Unfortunately, the moon had not yet risen, so I was unable to catch sight of the monster as he approached. I knew, however, that there was light enough for me to see him when he emerged from the bushes into the little clearing round the foot of our tree. Nearer and nearer we heard him coming steadily on, and I had my rifle ready, pointing it in the direction in which I expected his head to appear. But alas, just at that moment the wind veered round and blew straight from us towards the rhino, who scented us immediately, gave a mighty snort, and then dived madly away through the jungle. For some considerable time we could hear him crashing ponderously through everything that came in his way, and he must have gone a long distance before he recovered from his fright and slowed down to his usual pace. At any rate, we neither heard nor saw anything more of him, and spent a wakeful and uncomfortable night for nothing. My next attempt to bag a rhino took place some months later, on the banks of the Sabaki, and I was scarcely more successful. I had come down from Tsavo in the afternoon, accompanied by a Mahina, and finding a likely tree within a few yards of the river and with fresh footprints under it, I at once decided to take up my position for the night in its branches. Mahina preferred to sit where he could take a comfortable nap, and wedged himself in a fork of a tree some little way below me, but still some 8 or 10 feet from the ground. It was a calm and perfect night, such as can be seen only in the tropics. Everything looked mysteriously beautiful in the glorious moonlight, and stood out like a picture looked at through a stereoscope. From my perch among the branches, I watched first a water buck come to drink in the river, then a bush buck. Later a tiny pa'a emerged from the bushes and paused at every step with one graceful forefoot poised in the air, thoroughly on the alert and looking round carefully and nervously for any trace of a possible enemy. At length it reached the brink of the river in safety and stooped to drink. Just then I saw a jackal come up on its trail and begin carefully to stalk it, not even rustling a fallen leaf in its stealthy advance on the poor little antelope. All of a sudden, however, the jackal stopped dead for a second, and then made off out of sight as fast as he ever could go. I looked round to discover the cause of this hurried exit, and to my surprise saw a large and very beautiful leopard crouching down and moving noiselessly in the direction of our tree. At first I thought it must be stalking some animal on the ground below us, but I soon realized that it was Mahina that the brute was intent on. Whether, if left to himself, the leopard would actually have made a spring at my sleeping gun-bearer, I do not know, but I had no intention of letting him have a chance of even attempting this, so I cautiously raised my rifle and leveled it at him. Absolutely noiseless as I was in doing this, he noticed it. Possibly a glint of moonlight on the barrel caught his eye, and immediately disappeared into the bush before I could get in a shot. I at once woke Mahina and made him come up to more secure quarters behind me. For a long time after this, nothing disturbed our peace, but at last the quarry I had hoped for made his appearance on the scene. Just below us there was an opening in the elephant grass which lined the river's edge, and through this the broad stream shone like silver in the moonlight. Without warning, this gap was suddenly filled by a huge black mass, a rhino making his way very leisurely out of the shallow water. On he came with a slow, ponderous tread, combining a certain stateliness with his awkward strides. Almost directly beneath us he halted and stood for an instant clearly exposed to our view. This was my opportunity. I took careful aim at his shoulder and fired. Instantly and with extraordinary rapidity, the huge beast whirled round like a peg top, whereupon I fired again. This time I expected him to fall, but instead of that I had the mortification of seeing him rush off into the jungle and of hearing him crash through it like a great steamroller for several minutes. I consoled myself by thinking that he could not go far, as he was hard hit, and that I should easily find him when daylight arrived. Mahina, who was in a wild state of excitement over the burra jaguar, or great animal, was also of this opinion, and as there was no longer any reason for silence, he chatted to me about many strange and curious things until the gray dawn appeared. When we got down from our perch, we found the track of the wounded rhino clearly marked by great splashes of blood, and for a couple of miles the spoor could thus be easily followed. At length, however, it got fainter and fainter, and finally ceased altogether, so that we had to abandon the search. The ground round was rocky, and there was no possibility of telling which way our quarry had gone. I was exceedingly sorry for this, as I did not like to leave him wounded, but there was no help for it, so we struck out for home and arrived at Tsavo in the afternoon, very tired, hungry, and disappointed. Rhinos are extraordinary animals, and not in any way to be depended upon. One day they will sheer off on meeting a human being and make no attempt to attack. The next day, for no apparent reason, they may execute a most determined charge. I was told for a fact by an official who had been long in the country that on one occasion, while a gang of 21 slaves, chained neck to neck as was the custom, was being smuggled down to the coast and was proceeding in Indian file along a narrow path, a rhinoceros suddenly charged out at right angles to them, impaled the center man on its horns, and broke the necks of the remainder of the party by the suddenness of his rush. These huge beasts have a very keen sense of smell, but equally indifferent eyesight, and it is said that if a hunter will only stand perfectly still on meeting a rhino, he will pass by him without attempting to molest him. I feel bound to add, however, that I have so far failed to come across anybody who has actually tried the experiment. On the other hand, I have met one or two men who have been tossed on the horns of these animals, and they described it as very painful proceeding. It generally means being a cripple for life, if one even succeeds in escaping death. Mr. B. Eastwood, the chief accountant of the Uganda Railway, once gave me a graphic description of his marvelous escape from an infuriated rhino. He was on leave at the time on a hunting expedition in the neighborhood of Lake Baringo, about 80 miles north of the railway from Nakuru, and he had shot and apparently killed a rhino. On walking up to it, however, the brute rose to its feet and literally fell on him, breaking 4 ribs and his right arm. Not content with this, it then stuck its horn through his thigh and tossed him over its back, repeating this operation once or twice. Finally it lumbered off, leaving poor Eastwood helpless and fainting in the long grass where he had fallen. He was alone at the time, and it was not for some hours that he was found by his porters, who were only attracted to the spot by the numbers of vultures hovering about, waiting in their ghoulish manner for life to be extinct before beginning their meal. How he managed to live for the 8 days after this, which elapsed before a doctor could be got to him, I cannot imagine. But in the end he fortunately made a good recovery, the only sign of his terrible experience being the absence of his right arm, which had to be amputated. In a widow's story. Very shortly before I left Tsavo, I went, on March 11th, 1899, on inspection duty to Voi, which, as I have already mentioned, is about 30 miles on the Mombasa side of Tsavo. At this time it was a miserable, swampy spot where fever, guinea worm, and all kinds of horrible diseases were rampant. But this state of affairs has now been completely altered by drainage and by clearing away the jungle. Dr. Rose was in medical charge of the place at the time of my visit, and it was the good old custom to put up with any friend one came across towards nightfall. I made him my host when my day's work was over. We spent a very pleasant evening together and naturally discussed all the local news. Amongst other things, we chatted about the new road which was being constructed from Boy to a rather important missionary station called Taveta near Mount Kilimanjaro, and Dr. Rose mentioned that Mr. O'Hara, the engineer in charge of the road making, with his wife and children, was encamped in the Wai-Taita country, about 12 miles away from Voi. Early next morning, I went out for a stroll with my shotgun, but had not gone far from the doctor's tent when I saw in the distance 4 Swahili carrying something which looked like a stretcher along the newly made road. Fearing that some accident had happened, I went quickly to meet them and called out to ask what they were carrying. They shouted back, "Bwana, the master," and when I asked what Bwana, they replied, "Bwana O'Hara." On inquiring what had exactly happened, they told me that during the night their master had been killed by a lion, and that his wife and children were following behind along the road. At this I directed the men to the hospital and told them where to find Dr. Rose, and without waiting to hear any further particulars, hurried on as fast as possible to give what assistance I could to poor Mrs. O'Hara. Some considerable way back I met her toiling along with an infant in her arms, while a little child held on to her skirt, utterly tired out with the long walk. I helped her to finish the distance to the doctor's tent. She was so unstrung by her terrible night's experience and so exhausted by her trying march carrying the baby that she was scarcely able to speak. Dr. Rose at once did all he could, both for her and for the children, the mother being given a sleeping draught and made comfortable in one of the tents. When she appeared again late in the afternoon, she was much refreshed and was able to tell us the following dreadful story, which I shall give as nearly as possible in her own words. Quote, "We were all asleep in the tent, my husband and I in one bed and my 2 children in another. The baby was feverish and restless, so I got up to give her something to drink, and as I was doing so, I heard what I thought was a lion walking round the tent. I at once woke my husband and told him I felt sure there was a lion about. He jumped up and went out, taking his gun with him. He looked round the outside of the tent and spoke to the Swahili askari, who was on sentry by the campfire a little distance off. The askari said he had seen nothing about except a donkey, so my husband came in again, telling me not to worry, as it was only a donkey that I had heard. The night being very hot, my husband threw back the tent door and lay down again beside me. After a while I dozed off, but was suddenly roused by a feeling as if the pillow were being pulled away from under my head. On looking around, I found that my husband was gone. I jumped up and called him loudly, but got no answer. Just then I heard a noise among the boxes outside the door, so I rushed out and saw my poor husband lying between the boxes. I ran up to him and tried to lift him, but found I could not do so. I then called the askari to come and help me, but he refused, saying there was a lion standing beside me. I looked up and saw the huge beast glowering at me, not more than 2 yards away. At this moment the askari fired his rifle, and this fortunately frightened the lion, for it at once jumped off into the bush. All 4 askaris then came forward and lifted my husband back onto the bed. He was quite dead. We had hardly got back into the tent before the lion returned and prowled about in front of the door, showing every intention of springing in to recover his prey. The askaris fired at him, but did no damage beyond frightening him away again for a moment or two. He soon came back and continued to walk around the tent until daylight, growling and purring, and it was only by firing through the tent every now and then that we kept him out. At daybreak he disappeared, and I had my husband's body carried here, while I followed with the children until I met you." Unquote. Such was Miss O'Hara's pitiful story. The only comfort we could give her was to assure her that her husband had died instantly and without pain, for while she had been resting, Dr. Rose had made a post-mortem examination of the body and had come to this conclusion. He found that O'Hara had evidently been lying on his back at the time, and that the lion, seizing his head in its mouth, had closed its long tusks through his temples until they met again in the brain. We buried him before nightfall in a peaceful spot close by, the doctor reading the funeral service, while I assisted in lowering the rude coffin into the grave. It was the saddest scene imaginable. The weeping widow, the wondering faces of the children, the gathering gloom of the closing evening, the dusky forms of a few natives who had gathered round, all combined to make a most striking and solemn ending to a very terrible tragedy of real life. I am glad to say that within a few weeks' time, the lion that was responsible for this tragedy was killed by a poisoned arrow, shot from a treetop by one of the Wa-Taita. Chapter 17, An Infuriated Rhino. My work at Tsavo was finished in March 1899, and I received instructions to proceed to Railhead and take charge of a section of the work there. For many reasons, I was sorry to say goodbye to Tsavo, where I had spent an eventful year, but all the same I was very glad to be given this new post, as I knew that there would be a great deal of interesting work to be done, and a constant change of camp and scene, as the line progressed onward to the interior. In good spirits, therefore, I set out for my new headquarters on March 28th. By this time the railhead had reached a place called Machakos Road, some 276 miles from Mombasa, and within a few miles of the great Athi Plains, the latter being treeless and waterless expanses, bare of everything except grass, which the great herds of game keep closely cropped. After leaving Tsavo, the character of the country remains unaltered for some considerable distance, the line continuing to run through the thorny Nyika, and it is not until Makindo is reached, about 200 miles from the coast, that a change is apparent. From this place, however, the journey lies through a fairly open and interesting tract of country, where game of all kinds abounds, and can be seen grazing peacefully within a few hundred yards of the railway. On the way I was lucky enough to get some fine views of Kilimanjaro, the whole mountain from base to summit standing out clearly and grandly, with the lofty peak of Kibo topping the fleecy clouds with its snowy head. At Machakos Road I found the country and the climate very different from that to which I had grown accustomed to at Tsavo. Here I could see for miles across stretches of beautiful open downs, timbered here and there like an English park, and it was a great relief to be able to overlook a wide tract of country and to feel that I was no longer hemmed in on all sides by the interminable and depressing thorny wilderness. As Machakos Road is some 4,000 feet higher above the sea level than Tsavo, the difference in temperature was also very marked, and the air felt fresh and cool compared with that of the sun-baked valley in which I had spent the previous year. My instructions were to hurry on the construction of the line as fast as possible to Nairobi, the proposed headquarters of the railway administration, which lay about 50 miles further on across the Athi Plains, and I soon began to find plate-laying most interesting work. Everything has to move as if by clockwork. First, the earth's surface has to be prepared and rendered perfectly smooth and level. Cuttings have to be made and hollows banked up. Tunnels have to be bored through the hills and bridges thrown across rivers. Then a line of coolies move along, placing sleepers at regular intervals. Another gang drops the rails in their places. Yet another brings along the keys, fish plates, bolts, and nuts, while following these are the men who actually fix the rails on the sleepers and link up from one to another. Finally, the packing gang finishes the work by filling in earth and ballast under and around the steel sleepers to give them the necessary grip and rigidity. Some days we were able to lay only a few yards, while on other days we might do over a mile. All depended on the nature of the country we had to cover. On one occasion, we succeeded in breaking the record for a day's plate laying, and were gratified at receiving a telegram of congratulation from the Railway Committee at the Foreign Office. I made it my custom to take a walk each morning for some distance ahead of the rails along the central line of the railway, in order to spy out the land and to form a rough estimate of the material that would be required in the way of sleepers, girders, for temporary bridges, etc. It was necessary to do this in order to avoid undue delay taking place owing to the shortage of material of any kind. About 10 days after my arrival at Machakos Road, I walked in this way for about 5 or 6 miles ahead of the last laid rail. It was rather unusual for me to go so far, and as it happened, I was alone on this occasion, Mahina having been left behind in camp. About 2 miles away on my left, I noticed a dark-looking object, and thinking it was an ostrich, I started off towards it. Very soon, however, I found that it was bigger game than an ostrich, and on getting still nearer, made out the form of a great rhinoceros lying down. I continued to advance very cautiously, wriggling through the short grass until at length I got within 50 yards of where the huge beast was resting. Here I lay and watched him, but after some little time he evidently suspected my presence, for rising to his feet he looked straight in my direction, and then proceeded to walk round me in a half circle. The moment he got wind of me, he whipped round in his tracks like a cat, and came in for me beeline. Hoping to turn him, I fired instantly, but unfortunately my soft-nosed bullets merely annoyed him further, and had not the slightest effect on his thick hide. On seeing this, I flung myself down quite flat on the grass, and threw my helmet some 10 feet away, in the hope that he would perceive it and vent his rage on it instead of me. On he thundered, while I scarcely dared to breathe. I could hear him snorting and rooting up the grass quite close to me, but luckily for me he did not catch sight of me, and charged by a few yards to my left. As soon as he had passed me, my courage began to revive again, and I could not resist the temptation of sending a couple of bullets after him. These, however, simply cracked against his hide and splintered to pieces on it, sending the dry mud off in little clouds of dust. Their only real effect, indeed, was to make him still more angry. He stood stock still for a moment, then gored the ground most viciously and started off once more on the semicircle round me. This proceeding terrified me more than ever, and as I felt sure that he would come upwind at me again, I could scarcely hope to escape a second time. Unfortunately, my surmise proved correct, for directly he scented me. Up went his nose in the air, and down he charged like a battering ram. I fairly pressed myself into the ground as flat as I ever could, and luckily the grass was a few inches high. I felt the thud of his great feet pounding along, yet dared not move or look up lest he should see me. My heart was thumping like a steam hammer, and every moment I fully expected to find myself tossed into the air. Nearer and nearer came the heavy thudding, and I had quite given myself up for lost when from my lying position I caught sight, out of the corner of my eye, of the infuriated beast rushing by. He had missed me again. I never felt so relieved in my life, and assuredly did not attempt to annoy him further. He went off for good this time, and it was with great satisfaction that I watched him gradually disappear in the distance. I could not have believed it was possible that these huge, ungainly-looking brutes could move so rapidly, and turn and twist in their tracks just like monkeys, had I not actually seen this one do so before my eyes. If he had found me, he certainly would have pounded me to atoms, as he was an old bull and in a most furious and vicious mood. One day when Dr. Brock and I were out shooting, shortly after this incident and not far from where it occurred, we caught sight of 2 rhinos in a hollow some distance from us and commenced to stalk them, taking advantage of every fold in the ground in doing so and keeping about 50 yards apart in case of a charge. In the event one or other of us would be able to get in a broadside shot which would probably roll the beast over, proceeding carefully in this manner, we managed to get within about 60 yards of them, and as it was my turn for a shot, I took aim at the larger of the 2, just as it was moving its great head from one side to the other, wondering which of us it ought to attack. When at last it decided upon Brock, it gave me the chance I had been waiting for. I fired instantly at the hollow between neck and shoulder. The brute dropped at once, and save for 1 or 2 convulsive kicks in its stumpy legs as it lay half on its back, it never moved again. The second rhino proved to be a well-grown youngster, which showed considerable fight as we attempted to approach its fallen comrade. We did not want to kill it, and accordingly spent about 2 hours in shouting and throwing stones at it before we succeeded in driving it away. We then proceeded to skin our prize. This, as may be imagined, proved rather a tough job, but we managed it in the end. The trophy was well worth the pains I had taken to add it to my collection. Chapter 18. Lions on the Athi Plains. Shortly after I took charge at Railhead, we entered the Kapiti Plain, which gradually merges into the Athi Plain, and indeed is hardly to be distinguished from the latter in the appearance or general character of the country. Together they form a great tract of rolling downs covered with greens, and intersected here and there by dry ravines, along the baked banks of which a few stunted trees, the only ones to be seen, struggle to keep themselves alive. In all this expanse there is absolutely no water in the dry season, except in the Athi River, some 40 miles away, and in a few water holes known only to the wild animals. The great feature of the undulating plains, however, and the one which gives them a never-failing interest, is the great abundance of game of almost every conceivable kind. Here I myself have seen lion, rhinoceros, leopard, eland, giraffe, zebra, wildebeest, hartebeest, waterbuck, warthog, grantee, Thomsoni, impala, besides ostriches greater and lesser, bustard, marabout, and a host of other animals and birds too numerous to name, while along the Athi and close to its banks may be found large numbers of hippo and crocodiles. At the time I was there, these great plains also formed the principal grazing ground for the immense herds of cattle owned by the Maasai. I am very glad to say that the whole of this country on the south side of the railway, as far as the boundary of German East Africa, from Tsavo River on the east to the Kedong Valley on the west, is now a strictly protected game reserve, and so long as this huge expanse is thus maintained as a sanctuary, there can be no danger of any of these species becoming extinct. While crossing this dry expanse, the greatest difficulty I had to contend with was the provision of sufficient water for the 3,000 workmen employed about Railhead, for not a drop could be obtained on the way, nor could we hope for any until we had got to the other side of the plain and had reached the Athi River, which could not be accomplished under a couple of months. As we progressed onwards into the waterless belt, this became a very serious matter indeed, as any breakdown in the supply would have had the most disastrous consequences among so large a body of men working all day under the blazing sun of a tropical climate. Every day 2 trainloads of water in great tanks were brought up from the last stream we had passed, which of course daily fell further to the rear. This was a source of considerable delay, for the line was blocked all the time the water was being pumped into the tanks, and consequently no material for construction could come through, and a good deal of time was also wasted when the trains returned to Railhead in distributing the water to the workmen, who often quarreled and fought in their eagerness to get at it. At first I had most of the tank filling done by night, but on one occasion a line came unpleasantly close to the men working the pump, and so night work had to be abandoned. The coolies themselves were so anxious indeed to get a plentiful supply of water that once or twice some of the more daring spirits among them ventured to go out onto the plains in search of water holes, which, by reason of the large herds of game, we knew must exist somewhere. The only result of these expeditions, however, was that 3 of these men never returned. What befell them is not known to this day. When we had proceeded some distance across this dry land, and when I was experiencing to the full the disadvantage and delay caused by my tank trains, a native of some remote corner of the plains, with nothing by way of dress but a small piece of cowhide thrown over his left shoulder, came to my tent door one day and squatted down on his heels in the native fashion. On being asked his business, he said, "I have heard," he replied, "that the great master wants water. I can show it to him." This was good news, if it could be relied upon, so I questioned him closely and ascertained that some time previously, exactly how long I could not gather, he had been in the locality on a raiding expedition that had succeeded in finding water. I asked if the place was far away, and got the reply in Swahili, "Mbali Kidogo, a little distance." Now, I had had experience of Mbali Kidogo before. It is like the Irishman's mile and a bit. So I decided to start very early next morning on a search for this pond, for such my informant described it to me. In the meantime, the poor fellow, who appeared starving, there was a sore famine among the natives of the district at the time, was given food and drink, and made a ravenous meal. In the evening I had a long talk with him in broken Swahili round the campfire, and obtained some insight into many of the strange and barbarous customs of the Maasai, to which interesting tribe he belonged. In the morning I started off betimes, taking my 30-30 rifle and being accompanied by Mahina with the 12-bore shotgun, and by another Indian carrying the necessary food and water. Our Maasai guide, whose name we found to be Lungo, seemed to be quite certain of his way, and led us across the rolling plains more or less in the direction in which the railway was to run, but some miles to the right of its centre line. The march was full of interest, for on the way we passed within easy range of herds of wildebeest, hartebeest, gazelle, and zebra. I was out strictly on business, however, and did not attempt a shot, reserving that pleasure for the homeward trip. Late in the afternoon we arrived at Lungo's Pond, a circular dip about 80 yards in diameter, which without doubt had contained water very recently, but which, as I expected to find, was now quite dry. A considerable number of bones lay scattered round it, whether of kills or of animals which had died of thirst I could not say. Our guide appeared very much upset when we found the pond empty, and gave vent to many exclamations in his peculiar language, in which the letter R rolled like a kettle drum. Our search for water having thus proved a failure, I determined to try my luck with the game. The Maasai and the Indian were sent back to camp, while Mahina and I made a big detour from the dried-up waterhole. Game abounded in all directions, but the animals were much more shy than they had been in the morning, and it was in vain that I stalked, if it can be called stalking, when as a matter of fact one has to move in the open. Splendid specimens of Thompson's and Grant's gazelle. I might have attempted a shot once or twice, but the probability was that owing to the long range it would have resulted only in a wound, and I think there is nothing so painful as to see an animal limping about in a crippled condition. In this fruitless manner we covered several miles, and I was beginning to think that we should have to return to camp without so much as firing a shot, Just then, however, I saw a herd of wildebeest, and with much care I managed to get within 300 yards of them. I singled out the biggest head and waited for a favorable moment, fired at him, dropping him at once. I ran up to the fallen beast, which appeared to be dying, and told Mahina to drive the hunting knife right through his heart so as to put him quickly out of pain. As Mahina was not doing this as skillfully or as quickly as I thought might be done, and seemed unable to pierce the tough hide, I handed him my rifle and took the knife in order to do it myself. Just as I raised the knife to strike, I was startled by the wildebeest suddenly jumping to his feet. For a moment he stood looking at me in a dazed and tottery kind of way, and then to my amazement he turned and made off. At first he moved with such a shaky and uncertain gait that I felt confident that he could only go a few yards before dropping. So, as I did not wish to disturb the other game around us by firing a second shot, I thought it best just to wait. To my utter astonishment, however, after he had staggered up for about 60 yards, he seemed to revive suddenly, broke into his ordinary gallop, and quickly rejoined the herd. From that time I lost all trace of him, though I followed up for 4 or 5 miles. The wildebeest, in fact, is like Kipling's Fuzzy Wuzzy. He's generally shaman when he's dead. And my friend Rawson about this time had an experience very similar to mine, but attended with much more serious results. He had knocked his wildebeest over in much the same way, and thought it was dead. And as he was very keen on obtaining photographs of game, he took his stand camera from the Indian who carried it and proceeded to focus it on the animal's head. When he was just about to take the picture, he was thunderstruck to see the wildebeest jump up and come charging down upon him. He sprang quickly aside, and in an instant up went the camera into the air, followed by the next moment by the unfortunate Indian, the wildebeest having stuck its horn right through the man's thigh and tossed him over its back. Fortunately, the brute fell dead after this final effort, leaving Rawson grateful for his escape. After abandoning the chase of my wildebeest, we had not gone far on our way towards the home camp when I thought I observed something of a reddish color moving in a patch of long grass, a good distance to our left front. I asked Mahina if he could make out what it was, but he was unable to do so, and before I could get my field glasses to bear, the animal, whatever it was, had disappeared into the grass. I kept my eye on the spot, however, and we gradually approached it. When we were about 100 yards off, the reddish object again appeared, and I saw that it was nothing less than the shaggy head of a lion peeping over the long grass. This time Mahina also saw what it was and called out, "Dekko Sahib, sure. Look, master, a lion." I whispered to him to be quiet and to take no notice of him while I tried my best to follow my own advice. So we kept on, edging up towards the beast, but apparently oblivious to his presence, as he lay there grimly watching us. As we drew near, I asked Mahina in a whisper if he felt equal to facing a charge from the sure if I should wound him. He answered simply that where I went, there he would go also, and right well he kept his word. I watched the lion carefully out of the corner of my eye as we closed in. Every now and then he would disappear from view for a moment, and it was a fascinating sight to see how he slowly raised his massive head above the top of the grass again and gazed calmly and steadily at us as we neared him. Unfortunately, I could not distinguish the outline of his body, hidden as it was in the grassy thicket. I therefore circled cautiously round in order to see if the cover was sufficiently thin at the back to make a shoulder shot possible. But as we moved, the lion also twisted round and so always kept his head full on us. When I had described a half circle, I found that the grass was no thinner and that my chances of a shot had not improved. We were now within 70 yards of the lion, who appeared to take the greater interest in us the closer we approached. He had lost the sleepy look with which he had first regarded us, and now was fully on the alert. But he still did not give the impression that he meant to charge, and no doubt if we had not provoked him, he would have allowed us to depart in peace. I, however, was bent on war, in spite of the risk, which one must always run by attacking a lion at such close quarters, on an open plain as flat as the palm of the hand. So in a standing position, I took careful aim at his head and fired. The distance was, as I have said, a bare 70 yards, yet I must confess to a disgraceful miss. More astonishing still, the beast made not the slightest movement, did not even blink an eye, so far as I could see, but continued his steadfast, questioning gaze. Again I took aim, this time for a spot below the tip of his nose, and again I fired with more success, the lion turning a complete somersault over his tail. I thought he was done for, but he instantly sprang up to his feet again, and to my horror and astonishment was joined by a lioness whose presence we had never even thought of or suspected. Worse was still to follow, for to our dismay both made a most determined charge on us, bounding along at a great pace and roaring angrily as they came. Poor Mahina cried out, "Sahib, do sher atahai, master, 2 lions are coming." But I told him to stand stock still and for his life not to make the slightest movement. In the twinkling of an eye the 2 beasts had covered about 40 yards of the distance toward us. As they did not show the least sign of stopping, I thought we had given the experiment of remaining absolutely motionless a fair trial, and was just about to raise the rifle to my shoulder as a last resort, when suddenly the wounded lion stopped, staggered, and fell to the ground. The lioness took a couple of bounds nearer to us, and then to my unmeasured relief turned to look round for her mate, who had by this time managed to get to his feet again. There they both stood, growling viciously and lashing their tails, for what appeared to me to be a succession of ages. The lioness then made up her mind to go back to the lion, and they both stood broadside with their heads close together and turned towards us, snarling in a most aggressive manner. Had either of us moved hand or foot just then, it would, I am convinced, have at once brought on another and probably a fatal charge. As the 2 great brutes stood in this position looking at us, I had, of course, a grand opportunity of dropping both, but I confess I did not feel equal to it at the moment. I could only devoutly hope that they would not renew their attack, and was only too thankful to let them depart in peace if they would, without any further hostility on my part. Just at this juncture the lion seemed to grow suddenly very weak. He staggered some 10 yards back toward his lair, then fell to the ground. The lioness followed and lay down beside him, both still watching us and growling savagely. After a few seconds the lion struggled to his feet again and retreated a little further, the lioness accompanying him until he fell once more. The 3rd time the same thing took place, and at last I began to breathe more freely, as they had now reached the thicket from which they had originally emerged. Accordingly I took a shot at the lioness as she lay beside her mate, partly concealed in the long grass. I do not think I hit her, but anyhow she at once made off and bounded away at a great rate on emerging into the open. I sent a few bullets after her to speed her on her way, then cautiously approached the wounded lion. He was stretched out at a full length on his side, with his back towards me, but I could see by the heaving of his flanks he was not yet dead, so I put a bullet through his spine. He never moved after this, but for safety's sake, I made no attempt to go up to him for a few minutes, and then only after Mahina had planted a few stones on his body, just to make sure he was really dead. We both felt very pleased with ourselves as we stood over him and looked at his fine head, great paws, and long, clean, sharp tusks. He was a young but full-grown lion in fine condition, and measured 9 feet, 8.5 inches from tip to nose to tip of tail. My last shot had entered the spine close to the shoulder and lodged in the body. The first shot was a miss, as I have already said, but the second had caught him on the forehead, right between the eyes. The bullet, however, instead of traversing the brain, had been turned downwards by the frontal bone, through which it had crashed, finally lodging in the root of the tongue, the lead showing on both sides. I cut out the tongue and hung it up to dry, intending to keep it as a trophy, but unfortunately a vulture swooped down when my back was turned and carried it off. From the time I locked the lion over until he first staggered and fell, not more than a minute could have elapsed. Quite long enough, however, to have enabled him to cover the distance and to have seized one or other of us. Unquestionably, we owed our lives to the fact that we both remained absolutely motionless, and I cannot speak too highly of Mahina for the splendid way in which he stood the charge. Had he acted as did other gun boy I know of, the affair might not have had so happy an ending. This gun boy went out with Captain G in this very neighborhood, and not long after our adventure, G came across a lion just as we did, and wounded it. It charged down on them, but instead of remaining absolutely still, the terrified gun boy fled, with the result that the lion came furiously on, and poor G met with a terrible death. While Mahina was scouring the neighborhood in search of some natives to carry the skin back to camp, I took a good look round the place and found the half-eaten body of a zebra, which I noticed had been killed out in the open, then dragged into the long grass. The tracks told me also that all the work had been done by the lion, and this set me thinking of the lioness. I accordingly swept the plain with my glasses in the direction of which she bounded off, and after some searching I discovered her about a mile away, apparently lying down in the midst of a herd of hartebeest, who grazed away without taking any notice of her. I felt much inclined to follow her up, but I was afraid that if I did so, the vultures that were already hovering around would settle on my line and spoil the skin, for the destruction of which these ravenous birds are capable, even in the space of only a few minutes, is almost beyond belief. I accordingly returned to the dead beast and sat down astride of him. I had read that a frontal shot at a lion was a very risky one, and on carefully examining the head, it was easy to see the reason for owing to the sharp backward slope of the forehead, it is almost impossible for a bullet fired in this manner to reach the brain. As there were lots of lions about in this district, and as I wanted to bag some more, I set myself to think out a plan whereby the risk of a frontal shot might be got rid of. About a fortnight afterwards, I had an opportunity of putting my scheme into practice, happily with most excellent results. This, however, is another story, which will be told later on. I next commenced to skin my trophy and found it a very tough job to perform by myself. He proved to be a very fat beast, so I knew that Mahina would make a few honest and well-earned rupees out of him, for Indians will give almost anything for lion fat, believing that it is an infallible cure for rheumatism and various other diseases. When at length the skinning process was completed, I waited impatiently for the return of Mahina, who by this time had gone much longer than I expected. It is rather a nerve-shattering thing, I'm speaking for myself, to remain absolutely alone for hours on a vast open plain beside the carcass of a dead lion, with vultures incessantly wheeling about above one, and with nothing to be seen or heard for miles around except wild animals. It was a great relief, therefore, when after a long wait I saw Mahina approaching with a half a dozen practically naked natives in his train. It turned out that he had lost his way back to me, so that it was lucky he found me at all. We lost no time in getting back to camp, arriving there just at sundown, when my first business was to rub wood ashes into the skin and then stretch it on a portable frame which I had made a few days previously. The campfire was a big one that night, and the graphic and highly colored description which Mahina gave to the eager circle of listeners of the way in which we slew the lion would have made even Bahram, that great hunter, anxious for his fame. Chapter 23, A Successful Lion Hunt. When the Athi River had been bridged, the section of the line to Nairobi was pushed forward as rapidly as possible, and from dawn to dark we all exerted ourselves to the very utmost. One day, May 28th, the weather was exceptionally hot, and I had been out in the broiling sun ever since daylight superintending the construction of banks and cuttings and the erection of temporary bridges. On returning to my hut, therefore, at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I threw myself into a long deck chair, too tired for anything beyond a long, cool drink. Here I rested for an hour or so, amused by the bustle at the small wayside station we had just built, and idly watching our tiny construction engine forging its way, with a great deal of clanking and puffing, up a steep gradient just across the river. It was touch and go whether it would manage to get its heavy load of rails and sleepers to the top of the incline or not, and I became so interested in the contest between steam and friction and gravity that I did not notice that a visitor had approached and was standing quietly beside me. On hearing the unusual salutation, however, I turned round and saw a lean and withered half-bred Maasai, clothed in a very inadequate piece of wildebeest hide, which was merely slipped under the left arm and looped up in a knot over the right shoulder. He stood for a moment with the right hand held out on a level with the shoulder, the fingers extended and the palm turned towards me, all indicating that he came on a friendly visit. I returned his salutation and asked him what he wanted. Before answering, he dropped down on his heels, his old bones cracking as he did so. "I want to lead the great master to 2 lions," he said. "They have just killed a zebra and are now devouring it." On hearing this, I straightway forgot that I had already done a hard day's work in the full blaze of an equatorial sun. I forgot that I was tired and hungry. In fact, I forgot everything that was not directly connected with the excitement of lion hunting. Even the old savage at my feet grinned when he saw how keen I was about it. I plied him with questions. Were they both lions or lionesses? Had they manes? How far away were they? And so on. Naturally, to the last question he was bound to answer, "Mbali kidogo." Of course they were not far away. Nothing is ever to a native of East Africa. However, the upshot was that they were in a very few minutes I had a mule saddled, and with the old Maasai as a guide, started off accompanied by my faithful Mahina and another coolie to help bring home the skin if I should prove successful. I also left word for my friend Spooner, the district engineer, who happened to be absent from camp just at the moment, that I had gone after 2 lions, but hoped to be back by nightfall. We traveled at a good pace, and within an hour had covered fully 6 miles. Still there was no sign of lions. On the way we were joined by some Wakamba, even more scantily attired than our guide, and soon a dispute arose between these hangers-on and the old Masai, who refused to allow them to accompany us, as he was afraid that they would seize all the zebra meat that the lions had not already eaten. However, I told him not to bother, but to hurry up and show me the lions, and that I would look after him all right. Eventually, on getting to the low crest of one of the long swells in the ground, our guide extended a long skinny finger and said proudly, "Tazama Bawana, see, master." I looked in the direction in which he pointed, and sure enough, about 600 yards off were a lion and a lioness busily engaged in the carcass of a zebra. On using my field glasses, I was amused to observe a jackal in attendance on the pair. Every now and then he would come too close to the zebra, when the lion would make a short rush at him and scare him away. The little jackal looked almost ridiculous, scampering off before the huge beast with his tail well down, but no sooner did the lion stop and return to his meal than he crept nearer again. The natives say, by the way, that a lion will eat every kind of animal, including even other lions, except a jackal or a hyena. I was also interested to notice the way in which the lion got at the flesh of the zebra. He took a short run at the body, and putting his claws well into the skin, in this manner tore off great strips of the hide. While I was thus studying the picture, my followers became impatient at my inactivity, and coming up to the top of the rise, showed themselves on the skyline. The lion saw them at once, turning round and standing erect to stare at them. There was not an atom of cover to be seen, nor any chance of taking advantage of the rolling ground, for it did not slope in the required direction. So I started to walk in the open in a sidelong direction towards the formidable-looking pair. They allowed me to come 100 yards or so nearer to them, and then the lioness bolted, the lion following her at a more leisurely trot. As soon as they left the body of the zebra, my African following made a rush for it, and began a fierce fight over the remains, so that I had to restore order and leave a coolie to see that our guide got the large share, as he deserved. In the meantime, the lion, hearing the noise of the squabble, halted on the crest of the hill to take a deliberate look at me, and then disappeared over the brow. I jumped onto my mule and galloped as hard as I could after him, and luckily found the pair still in sight when I reached the top of the rise. As soon as they saw me following them up, the lioness took covert in some long grass that almost concealed her when she lay down, but the lion continued to move steadily away. Accordingly, I made for a point which would bring me about 200 yards to the right of the lioness, and which would leave a deep natural hollow between us, so as to give me a better chance, in the event of a charge, of bowling her over as she came up the rise towards me. I could plainly make out her light-colored form in the grass, and took careful aim and fired. In an instant she was kicking on her back and tossing about, evidently hard hit. In a few seconds more she lay perfectly still, and I saw that she was dead. I now turned my attention to the lion, who meanwhile had disappeared over another rise. By this time Mahina and the other Indian, with 3 or 4 of the disappointed Wakamba, had come up, so we started off in a body in pursuit of him. I felt sure that he was lurking somewhere in the grass not far off, and I knew that I could depend upon the native eye to find him if he showed so much as the tip of his ear. Nor was I disappointed, for we had scarcely topped the next rise when one of the Wakamba spotted the dark brown head of the brute as he raised it for an instant above the grass in order to watch us. We pretended not to have seen him, however, and advanced to within 200 yards or so, when, as he seemed to be getting uneasy, I thought it best to risk a shot even at this range. I put up the 200-yard sight, and the bullet fell short, but the lion never moved. Raising the sight another 50 yards, I rested the rifle on Mahina's back for the next shot, and again missed. Fortunately, however, the lion still remained quiet. I then decided to put into practice the scheme I had thought out the day I sat astride the lion I had killed on the Kapiti plain. So I told all my followers to move off to the right, taking the mule with them, and to make a half-circle round the animal, while I lay motionless in the grass and waited. The ruse succeeded admirably, for as the men moved round, so did the lion, offering me at last a splendid shoulder shot. I took very careful, steady aim and fired, with the result that he rolled over and over. Then he made 1 or 2 attempts to get up, but failed. I then ran up to within a few yards of him, and, helpless as he was with a bullet through both shoulders, he was still game, and twisted round so as to face me, giving vent all the time to savage growls. A final shot laid him out, however, and we at once proceeded to skin him. While we were busy doing this, one of the Wakamba suddenly drew my attention to the fact that we were actually being stalked at that very moment by 2 other lions, who eventually approached to within 500 yards distance, then lay down to watch us skinning their dead brother, their big shaggy heads rising every now and again above the grass to give us a prolonged stare. At the time I knew little what a stirring adventure was in store for me next day while in pursuit of those same brutes. It was almost dark when the skinning process was finished, so without delay we started on our way back to camp, which was about 7 miles off. The lioness I thought I should leave to be skinned the next day, but the men I sent out to do the job on the morrow were unable to find any trace of her. They probably missed the place where she lay, for I'm sure that I killed her. It was a good 2 hours after night had fallen before we got anywhere near the railway, and the last few miles I was obliged to do by the guidance of the stars. Tramping over the plain on a pitch-dark night, with lions and rhino all about, was by no means pleasant work, and I heartily wished myself and my men safely back in camp. Indeed, I was beginning to think that I must have lost my bearings and was getting anxious about it, when to my relief I heard a rifle shot about a half a mile ahead of us. I guessed at once that it was fired by my good friend Spooner in order to guide me, so I gave a reply signal, and on getting to the top of the next rise, I saw the plain in front of me, all twinkling with lights. When he found that I had not returned by nightfall, Spooner had become nervous about me, and fearing that I had met with some mishap, had come out with a number of the workmen in camp to search for me in the direction I had taken in the afternoon. He was delighted to find me safe and sound, and with a lion skin as a trophy, while I was equally glad to have his escort and company back to camp, which was still over a mile away. When we had settled down comfortably to dinner that night, I fired Spooner's sporting ardor by telling him of the fine pair of lions who had watched us skinning their companion, and we agreed at once to go out the next day and try to bag them both. Spooner and I had often had many friendly arguments in regard to the comparative courage of the lion and the tiger, he holding the view that Stripes was the more formidable foe, while I, though admitting to the full the courage of the tiger, maintained from lively personal experience that the lion, when once roused, was unequaled for pluck and daring, and was in fact the most dangerous enemy one could meet with. He may at times slink off and not show fight, but get him in the mood or wound him, and only his death or yours will end the fray. That at least was my experience of the East African lions. I think that Spooner has now come round to my opinion, his conversion taking place the next day in a very melancholy manner. Chapter 24. Bhuta's Last Shikar. Long after I had retired to rest that night, I lay awake listening to roar answering roar in every direction round our camp, and realized that we were indeed in the midst of a favorable haunt of the king of beasts. It is one thing to hear a lion in captivity, when one knows he is safe behind iron bars, but quite another to listen to him when he is ramping around in the vicinity of one's fragile tent, with which a single blow he could tear to pieces. Still, all this roaring was of good omen for the next day's sport. According to our overnight arrangement, we were up betimes in the morning, but as there was a great deal of work to be done before we could get away, it was quite midday before we made ready to start. I ought to mention before going further that as a rule Spooner declined my company on shooting trips, as he was convinced that I should get scuppered sooner or later if I persisted in going after lions with a pop gun, as he contemptuously termed my 30-03. Indeed, this was rather a bone of contention between us, he being a firm believer, and rightly, in a heavy weapon for big and dangerous game, while I always did my best to defend the 30-03, which I was in the habit of using. On this occasion we effected a compromise for the day, accepting the loan of a spare 12-bore rifle as a second gun in case I should get to close quarters. But my experience has been that it is always a very dangerous thing to rely on a borrowed gun or rifle unless it has precisely the same action as one's own, and certainly in this instance it almost proved disastrous. Having thus seen to our rifles and ammunition, and taking care also that some brandy was put in the luncheon basket in case of an accident, we set off early in the afternoon in Spooner's Tonga, which is a two-wheeled cart with a hood over it. The party consisted of Spooner and myself, Spooner's Indian shikari Bhuta, my own gunboy Mahina, and two other Indians, one of whom, Imam Din, rode in the Tonga, while the other led a spare horse called Blaze Away. Now it may seem a strange plan to go lion hunting in the Tonga, but there is no better way of getting about country like the Ati Plains where, so long as it is dry, there is little or nothing to obstruct wheeled traffic. Once started, we rattled over the smooth expanse at a good rate, and on the way bagged a hartebeest and a couple of gazelle, as fresh meat was badly needed in camp. Besides, they offered most tempting shots, for they stood stock still gazing at us, struck no doubt by the novel appearance of our conveyance. Next we came upon a herd of wildebeest, and here we allowed Bhuta, who was a wary shikari and old servant of Spooner's, to stalk a solitary bull. He was highly pleased at this favor and did the job admirably. At last we reached the spot where I had seen the two lions on the previous day, a slight hollow covered with long grass, but there was now no trace of them to be discovered, so we moved further on and had another good beat round. After some little time, the excitement began by our spying the black-tipped ears of a lioness projecting above the grass, and the next moment a very fine lion arose from beside her and gave us a full view of his grand head and mane. After staring fixedly at us in an inquiring sort of way as we slowly advanced upon them, they both turned and slowly trotted off, the lion stopping every now and again to gaze round in our direction. Very imposing and majestic he looked, too, as he thus turned his great shaggy head defiantly towards us, and Spooner had to admit that it was the finest sight he had ever seen. For a while we followed them on foot, but finding at length that they were getting away from us and would soon be lost to sight over a bit of rising ground, we jumped quickly into the tonga and galloped around the base of the knoll so as to cut off their retreat, the excitement of the rough and bumpy ride being intensified 100-fold by the probability of our driving slap into the pair on rounding the rise. On getting to the other side, however, they were nowhere to be seen, so we drove on as hard as we could to the top, whence we caught sight of them about 400 yards away. As there seemed to be no prospect of getting nearer, we decided to open fire at this range, and at the third shot the lioness tumbled over my .30-03. At first I thought I had done for her, as for a few minutes she lay on the ground kicking and struggling, but in the end, although evidently badly hit, she rose to her feet and followed the lion, who had escaped uninjured, into some long grass from which we could not hope to dislodge them. As it was now late in the afternoon, and as there seemed no possibility of inducing the lions to leave the thicket in which they had concealed themselves, we turned back towards camp, intending to come out again the next day to track the wounded lioness. I was now riding Blaze away, and was trotting along in advance of Latonga, when suddenly he shied badly at a hyena, which sprang up out of the grass almost from beneath his feet, and quickly scampered off. I pulled up for a moment and sat watching the hyena's ungainly bounds, wondering whether he were worth a shot. Suddenly I felt Blaze away trembling violently beneath me, and on looking over my left shoulder to discover the reason, I was startled to see two fine lions not more than 100 yards away, evidently the pair which I had seen the day before and which we had really come in search of. They looked as if they meant to dispute our passage, for they came slowly towards me for about 10 yards or so, and then lay down, watching me steadily all the time. I called out to Spooner, "Here are the lions I told you about," and he whipped up the ponies, and in a moment or two he was beside me with the tonga. By this time I had seized my .30-03 and dismounted, so we at once commenced a cautious advance on the crouching lions, the arrangement being that Spooner was to take the right hand one and I the other. We had got to within 60 yards range without incident, and were just about to sit down comfortably to pot them, when they suddenly surprised us by turning and bolting off. I managed, however, to put a bullet into the one that I had marked, just as he crested a bank, and he looked very grand as he reared up against the sky and clawed the air on feeling the lead. For a second or two he gave me the impression that he was about to charge, but luckily he changed his mind and followed his companion, who had so far escaped scot-free. I immediately mounted Blaze away and galloped off in hot pursuit, and after about a half a mile of very stiff going got up with them once more. Finding now that they could not get away, they halted, came to bay, then charged down upon me, the wounded lion leading. I had left my rifle behind, so all I could do was to turn and fly as fast as Blaze away could go, praying inwardly the while that he would not put his foot into a hole. When the lions saw that they were unable to overtake me, they gave up the chase and lay down again, the wounded one being about 200 yards in front of the other. At once I pulled up too, and then went back a little way, keeping a careful eye upon them. And I continued these tactics of riding up and down at a respectful distance until Spooner came up with the rifles, when we renewed the attack. As a first measure, I thought it advisable to disable the unhurt lion if possible, and still using the .30-03, I got him with the second shot at a range of about 300 yards. He seemed badly hit, for he sprang into the air and apparently fell heavily. I then exchanged my .30-03 for Spooner's spare 12-bore rifle, and we turned our attention to the nearer lion, who all this time had been lying perfectly still, watching our movements closely, and evidently just waiting to be down upon us the moment we came within charging distance. He was never given his opportunity, however, for we did not approach nearer than 90 yards, When Spooner sat down comfortably and knocked him over quite dead with one shot from his 5.77, the bullet entering the left shoulder obliquely and passing through the heart. It was now dusk, and there was no time to be lost if we meant to bag the second lion as well. We therefore resumed our cautious advance, moving to the right as we went, so as to get behind us what light there was remaining. The lion, of course, twisted round in the grass in such a way as always to keep facing us, and looked very ferocious, so that I was convinced that unless he were entirely disabled by the first shot, he would be down on us like a whirlwind. All the same, I felt confident that, even in this event, one of us would succeed in stopping him before he could do any damage, but in this I was unfortunately to be proven mistaken. Eventually we managed to get within 80 yards of the enraged animal, I being about 5 yards to the left front of Spooner, who was followed by Buta at about the same distance to his right rear. By this time the lion was beside himself with fury, growling savagely and raising quite a cloud of dust by lashing his tail against the ground. It was clearly high time that we did something, so asking Spooner to fire, dropped one knee and waited. Nor was I kept long in suspense, for the moment Spooner's shot rang out, up jumped the lion and charged down in a beeline for me, coming in long, low bounds at great speed. I fired the right barrel at about 50 yards, but apparently missed, the left at about half that range, still without stopping effect. I knew just then that there was no time to reload, so remained kneeling, expecting him to be on me in the next moment. Suddenly, just as he was within a bound of me, he made a quick turn to my right. Good heavens, I thought, he's going for Spooner. I was wrong in this, however, for like a flash he passed Spooner also, and with a last tremendous bound seized Buta by the leg, and rolled over and over with him for some yards in the impetus of the rush. Finally he stood over him and tried to seize him by the throat, which the brave fellow prevented by courageously stuffing his left arm right into the great jaws. Poor Buta. By moving at the critical moment, he had diverted the lion's attention from me and had drawn the whole fury of the charge onto himself. All this, of course, happened in only a second or two. In the short instant that intervened, I felt a cartridge thrust into my hand by Spooner's plucky servant, Imam Din, who had carried the 12-bore all day, and who had stuck to me gallantly throughout the charge. And shoving it in, I rushed as quickly as I could to Buddha's rescue. Meanwhile, Spooner had got there before me, and when I came up actually had his left hand on the lion's flank, in a vain attempt to push him off Buddha's prostrate body, and so get at the heavy rifle which the poor fellow still stoutly clutched. The lion, however, was so busy engaged mauling Buddha's arm that he paid not the slightest attention to Spooner's efforts. Unfortunately, as he was facing straight in my direction, I had to move up in full view of him, and the moment I reached his head, he stopped chewing the arm, though still holding it in his mouth, and threw himself back on his haunches, preparing for a spring, at the same time curling back his lips and exposing long tusks in a savage snarl. I knew then that I had not a moment to spare, so I threw the rifle up to my shoulder and pulled the trigger. Imagine my utter despair and horror when it did not go off. Misfire again, I thought, and my heart almost stopped beating. As I took a step backwards, I felt it was all over. No, for he would never give me time to extract the cartridge and load again. Still, I took another step backwards, keeping my eyes fixed on the lions, which were blazing with rage. And in the middle of my third step, just as the brute was gathering himself for a spring, it suddenly struck me that in my haste and excitement, I had forgotten that I was using a borrowed rifle and had not pulled back the hammer. My own was hammerless. To do this and put a bullet through the lion's brain was then the work of a moment, and he fell dead instantly right on top of Buddha. We did not lose a moment in rolling his great carcass off of Buddha's body and quickly forced opening the jaws so as to disengage the mangled arm which still remained in his mouth. By this time the poor shikari was in a fainting condition, and we flew to the tonga for the brandy flask which we had so providentially brought with us. On making a rough examination of the wounded man, we found that his left arm and right leg were both frightfully mauled, the latter being broken as well. He was lifted tenderly into the tonga. How thankful we now were to have it with us, and Spooner at once set off with him to camp and the doctor. Before following them home, I made a hasty examination of the dead lion and found him to be a very good specimen in every way. I was particularly satisfied to see that one of the 2 shots I had fired as he charged down upon me had taken effect. The bullet had entered below the right eye, and only just missed the brain. Unfortunately, it was a steel one which Spooner had unluckily brought in his ammunition bag by mistake. Still, one would have thought that a shot of this kind, even with a hard bullet, would at least have checked the lion for the moment. As a matter of fact, however, It went clean through him without having the slightest stopping effect. My last bullet, which was of soft lead, had entered close to the right eye and embedded itself in the brain. By this time it had grown almost dark, so I left the 2 dead lions where they lay and rode for camp, which I was lucky enough to reach without further adventure or mishap. I may mention here that early next morning 2 other lions were found devouring the one we had first shot, but they had not had the time to do much damage, and the head, which I have had mounted, makes a very fine trophy indeed. The lion that mauled Buta was untouched. On my arrival in camp, I found that everything that was possible was being done for poor Buta by Dr. McCulloch, who the same who had traveled up with me to Tsavo and shot the ostrich from the train on my first arrival in the country, and who was luckily in the spot. His wounds had been skillfully dressed, the broken leg put in splints, and under the influence of a soothing draught, the poor fellow was soon sleeping peacefully. At first we had great hope of saving both life and limb, and certainly for some days he seemed to be getting on as well as could be expected. The wounds, however, were very bad ones, especially those on the leg where the long tusks had met through and through the flesh, leaving over a dozen deep tooth marks. The arm, though dreadfully mauled, soon healed. It was wonderful to notice how cheerfully the old shikari bore it all, and a pleasure to listen of his tale of how he would have his revenge on the whole tribe of lions as soon as he was able to get about again. But alas, his shikar was over. The leg got rapidly worse, and mortification setting in, it had to be amputated halfway up the thigh. Dr. Winston Waters performed the operation most skillfully, and curiously enough the operating table was canopied with the skin of the lion which had been responsible for the injury. Buta made a good recovery from the operation, but seemed to lose heart when he found that he had only 1 leg left, as according to his ideas he had now but a poor chance of being allowed to enter heaven. We did all that was possible for him, and Spooner especially could not have looked after a brother more tenderly. But to our great sorrow he sank gradually and died on July 19th. The hunt, which had such a disastrous sequel, proved to be the last occasion on which I had met a lion in the open, as we got out of the hunting country shortly afterwards, and for the rest of my stay in East Africa I had too much work to do to be able to go any distance in search of big game. Chapter 25. A Man-Eater in a Railway Carriage. Towards the end of my stay in British East Africa, I dined one evening with Mr. Ryall, the superintendent of the police, in his inspection carriage on the railway. Poor Ryall! I little thought then what a terrible fate was to overtake him only a few months later in that very carriage in which we dined. A man-eating lion had taken up his quarters at a little roadside station called Kema, and had developed an extraordinary taste for the members of the railway staff. He was a most daring brute, quite indifferent as to whether he carried off the station master, the signalman, or the pointsman, and one night, in his efforts to obtain a meal, he actually climbed on top of the roof of the station buildings and tried to tear off the corrugated iron sheets. At this, the terrified Babu in charge of the telegraph instrument below sent the following laconic message to the traffic manager: "Lion fighting with station. Send urgent succour." Fortunately, he was not victorious in his fight with the station, but he tried so hard to get in that he cut his feet badly on the iron sheeting, leaving large bloodstains on the roof. Another night, however, he succeeded in carrying off the native driver of the pumping engine, and soon afterwards added several other victims to his list. On one occasion, an engine driver arranged to sit up all night in a large iron-water tank in the hope of getting a shot at him, and had a loophole cut in the side of the tank from which to fire. But as so often happens, the hunter became the hunted. The lion turned up in the middle of the night, overthrew the tank, and actually tried to drag the driver out through the narrow circular hole in the top through which he had squeezed in. Fortunately, the tank was just too deep for the brute to be able to reach the man at the bottom, but the latter was naturally half paralyzed with fear and had to crouch so low down as to be unable to take anything like proper aim. He fired, however, and succeeded in frightening the lion away for the time being. It was in a vain attempt to destroy this pest that poor Ryle met his tragic and untimely end. On June 6, 1900, he was traveling up in his inspection carriage from Makindu to Nairobi, accompanied by 2 friends, Mr. Hubner and Mr. Parenti. When they reached Kima, which is about 250 miles from Mombasa, they were told that the man-eater had been seen close to the station only a short time before their train arrived, so they at once made up their minds to remain there for the night and endeavored to shoot him. Ryall's carriage was accordingly detached from the train and shunted into a siding, close to the station, where, owing to the unfinished state of the line, it did not stand perfectly level, but had a pronounced list to one side. In the afternoon, the three friends went out to look for the lion, but finding no traces of him whatever, they returned to the carriage for dinner. Afterwards, they all sat up on guard for some time, but the only noticeable thing they saw was what they took to be two very bright and steady glowworms. After events proved that these could have been nothing else than the eyes of the man-eater steadily watching them all the time and studying their every movement. The hour now growing late, and there being apparently no sign of the lion, Rael persuaded his two friends to lie down, while he kept the first watch. Hubner occupied the high berth over the table on the one side of the carriage, the only other berth being on the opposite side of the compartment and lower down. This Rael offered to Parenti, who declined it, saying he would be quite comfortable on the floor, and he accordingly lay down to sleep, with his feet towards the sliding door which gave admission to the carriage. It is supposed that Rael, after watching for some considerable time, must have come to the conclusion that the lion was not going to make its appearance that night, for he lay down on the lower berth and dozed off. No sooner had he done so, doubtless, than the cunning man-eater began cautiously to stalk the three sleepers. In order to reach the little platform at the end of the carriage, he had to mount two very high steps from the railway line, but these he managed to negotiate successfully and in silence. The door from this platform into the carriage was a sliding one on two wheels, which ran very easily on a brass runner, and as it was probably not quite shut, or at any rate not secured in any way, it was an easy matter for the lion to thrust in a paw and shove it open. But owing to the tilt of the carriage and to his great extra weight on one side, the door slid to and snapped into the lock the moment he got his body right in, thus leaving him shut up with the three sleeping men in their compartment. He sprang at once at Rael, but in order to reach him had actually to plant his feet on Parenti, who, it will be remembered, was sleeping on the floor. At this moment Hubner was suddenly awakened by a loud cry, and on looking down from his berth was horrified to see an enormous lion standing with his hind feet on Parenti's body, while his forepaws rested on poor Rael. Small wonder that he was panic-stricken at the sight. There was only one possible way of escape, and that was through the second sliding door communicating with the servants' quarters, which was opposite to that by which the lion had entered. But in order to reach this door, Hubner had literally to jump on the man-eater's back, for its great bulk filled up all the space beneath his berth. It sounds scarcely credible, but it appears that in the excitement and horror of the moment he actually did this, and fortunately the lion was too busily engaged with his victim to pay any attention to him. So he managed to reach the door in safety, but there, to his dismay, he found that it was held fast on the other side by the terrified coolies, who had been aroused by the disturbance caused by the lion's entrance. In utter desperation, he made frantic efforts to open it, and exerting all his strength, he at last managed to pull it back sufficiently far to allow him to squeeze through, when the trembling coolies instantly tied it up again with their turbans. A moment afterwards a great crash was heard, and the whole carriage lurched violently to one side. The lion had broken through one of the windows, carrying off poor Rael with him. Being now released, Parenti lost no time in jumping through the window on the opposite side of the carriage, and fled for refuge in one of the station buildings. His escape was little short of miraculous, as the lion had been actually standing on him as he lay on the floor. The carriage itself was badly shattered, and the woodwork of the window had been broken to pieces by the passage of the lion as he sprang through with his victim in his mouth. All that can be hoped is that poor Rael's death was instantaneous. His remains were found the next morning about a quarter of a mile away in the bush, and were taken to Nairobi for burial. I'm glad to be able to add that very shortly afterwards the terrible brute who was responsible for this awful tragedy was caught in an ingenious trap constructed by one of the railway staff. He was kept on view for several days and then shot. Chapter 26, Work at Nairobi. Although the lion which caused poor Buta's death was the last I managed to shoot in East Africa, I saw several others afterwards while traveling up and down the line at different times on construction work. In particular, I remember one very curious incident which happened early in the morning of June 2nd, when I was traveling towards Nairobi, accompanied by Dr. McCulloch. The doctor was going home on leave in the course of a few days, and was bemoaning to me his bad luck in never having shot or even seen a lion all the time he had been in country. We were standing on the engine at the time, facing each other, with his back to the north. "My dear Mac," I said, "it is because you don't look out for them." "Rubbish," he retorted. I do nothing else when I am out hunting. Well, I replied, are you really very anxious to shoot one before you go home? I would rather get a lion than anything else in the world, was the emphatic reply. Very good then, Sultan, I called the driver. Stop the engine. Now, Mac, I continued as the train was quickly brought to a standstill, here's a chance for you. Just jump off and bag those two over there. He turned around in blank astonishment and could hardly believe his eyes when he saw two fine lions, only about 200 yards off, busily engaged in devouring a wildebeest, which they had evidently just killed. I had spotted them almost as soon as Mac had begun to talk of his bad luck, and had only waited to tell him until we got near, so as to give him a greater surprise. He was off the engine in a second and made directly for the two beasts. Just as he was about to fire, one of them bolted, so I called out to him to shoot the other quickly before he too made good his escape. This one was looking at us over his shoulder with one paw on the dead wildebeest. While he stood at this attitude, Mac dropped him with a bullet through the heart. Needless to say, he was tremendously delighted with his success, and after the dead lion had been carried to the train and propped up against the carriage, I took a photograph of him standing beside his fine trophy. 3 days after this incident, Railhead reached Nairobi, and I was given charge of the new division of the line of Nairobi, was to be the headquarters of the railway administration, so there was an immense amount of work to be done in converting an absolutely bare plain 327 miles from the nearest place where even a nail could be purchased into a busy railway center. Roads and bridges had to be constructed, houses and workshops built, turntables and station quarters erected, a water supply laid on, and 101 other things done which go to the making of a railway township. Wonderfully soon, however, the nucleus of the present town began to take shape, and a thriving bazaar sprang into existence with a mushroom-like growth. In this, however, a case or two of plague broke out before very long, so I gave the natives and Indians who inhabited it an hour's notice to clear out, and on my own responsibility promptly burned the whole place to the ground. For this somewhat arbitrary proceeding I was mildly called over the coals, as I expected, but all the same it effectually stamped out the plague, which did not reappear during the time I was in the country. With a little persuasion I managed to induce several hundred of the Wa-Kikiyu, in whose country we now were, to come and work at Nairobi, and very useful and capable they proved themselves after a little training. They frequently brought me in word that the shambas, or plantations, at the back of the hill on which my camp was pitched were being destroyed by elephants, but unfortunately I could never spare time to go out in quest of them. On one occasion, however, I passed the news to my friend, Dr. Winston Waters, with the result that he had a most exciting adventure with a big bull elephant. He set out in quest for the predator, and guided by a few of the Wa-Kikuyu, soon came upon him hidden among some shady trees. Waters was a great believer in a close shot, so he stalked up to within a few yards of the animal and then fired his .577, aiming for the heart. The elephant responded by a prompt and determined charge, and although Waters quickly let him have the left barrel as well, it proved of no effect, and on he came, screaming and trumpeting with rage. There was nothing for it, therefore, but to fly for dear life, so down a path raced Waters, for all he was worth, the elephant giving vigorous chase and gaining rapidly. In a few seconds matters began to look very serious for the sportsman, for the huge monster was almost on him, but at the critical moment he stepped onto the false cover of a carefully concealed game pit and disappeared from view as if by magic. This sudden descent of his enemy apparently into the bowels of the earth so startled the elephant that he stopped short in his career and made off into the jungle. As for Waters, he was luckily none the worse for his fall, as the pit was neither staked at the bottom or very deep. He soon scrambled out, and following up the wounded elephant, succeeded in finishing him off without further trouble. Towards the end of 1899, I left for England. A few days before I started, all my Wa-Kikuyu children, as they called themselves, came in body and begged to be taken with me. I pictured to them the cold, wet climate of England, and its great distance from their native land, but they assured me that these were nothing to them, as they only wished to continue my children and to go wherever I went. I could hardly imagine myself arriving in London with a bodyguard of 400 more or less naked savages, but it is only with difficulty that I persuaded them that they had better remain in their own country. The ever-faithful Mahina, my boy Roshan Khan, my honest Chowdukar, Mian, and a few other coolies who had been a long time with me, accompanied me to the coast, where they bade me a sorrowful farewell, and left for India the day before I sailed on my homeward journey. Chapter 27, The Finding of the New Eland. During the early part of last year, 1906, I revisited the scene of my former labors and adventures on a shooting trip. Unfortunately, the train by which I traveled up from Mombasa reached Tsavo at midnight, but all the same I got out and prowled about as long as time would permit, half wondering every moment if the ghosts of the two man-eaters would spring at me out of the bushes. I wanted very much to spend a day or two in the old place, but my companions were anxious to push on as quickly as possible to better hunting grounds. I took the trouble, however, to wake them out of their peaceful slumbers in order to point out to them by the pale moonlight the strength and beauty of the Tsavo Bridge. But I fear this delicate little attention was scarcely appreciated as it deserved. Naturally, I could not expect them or anyone else to view the bridge quite from my point of view. I looked on it as a child of mine, brought up through stress and danger and troubles of all kinds. But the ordinary traveler, of course, knows nothing of this, and doubtless thinks it only a very commonplace and insignificant structure indeed. We spent a few days at Nairobi, now a flourishing town of some 6,000 inhabitants, supplied with every modern comfort and luxury, including a well-laid-out racecourse, and after a short trip to Lake Victoria, Nyanza, and Uganda, we made our way back to Eldama Ravine, which lies some 20 miles north of Londiani Station in the province of Naivasha. Here we started in earnest on our big game expedition, which I am glad to say proved to be a most delightful and interesting one in every way. The country was lovely, and the climate cool and bracing. We all got a fair amount of sport, our bag including rhino, hippo, waterbuck, reedbuck, hartebeest, wildebeest, ostrich, impala, oryx, roan antelope, etc. But for the present I must confine myself to a short account of how I was lucky enough to shoot a specimen of an entirely new race of eland. Our party of 5, including one lady who rode and shot equally straight, left the Eldama Ravine on January 22nd and trekked off in an easterly direction across the Laikipia Plateau. As the trail on which we were to take was very little known and almost impossible to follow without a guide, Mr. Foker, the district officer at the ravine, very kindly procured us a reliable man, a young Washin Gishu Masai named Uliagurma. But as he could not speak a word of Swahili, we had to engage an interpreter, an excellent cheery fellow of the same tribe named Landalu. And he in his turn possessed a kinsman who insisted on coming too, although he was no earthly use to us. Our route took us through the Solai Swamp, over the Multilo and Subuko Lultian ranges, and across many unexpected rivers and streamlets. On our first march, I noticed that Uliagurma, our Kirongozi or guide, was suffering extremely, though uncomplainingly, from earache, so I told him to come to me when we got to camp, and I could see what I could do for him. Strange to say, my doctoring proved most successful, and Uliagurma was so grateful that he spread my fame as a medicine man far and wide among the natives wherever we trekked. The consequence was that men, women, and children in every state of disease and crippledom came and besieged our camps, begging for some of the magical dawa or medicine. I used to do what I could, and only hope I did not injure many of them, but it was heart-rending to see some of the quite hopeless cases I was expected to cure. After we had climbed the Subu-Ko, Lultian, and got a footing on the plateau, we pitched our camp on the banks of the Angarua River, where we found a big Maasai kraal, the inhabitants of which seemed much astonished at our sudden appearance in their neighborhood. They were very friendly, however, and visited our camp in swarms an hour or so after our arrival. Riding my pony and accompanied by a Landalu as interpreter, and my gun-bearer Juma, I returned their call in the afternoon, when the El Morani, or warriors, gave, for my entertainment, an exhibition of the gymnastic exercises which they practice regularly in order to more particularly to strengthen their legs and render them supple. After the performance, I asked if there was any game about, and was told that some might be found a few miles to the north of the kraal. So I set out at once with Landalu and Juma to try my luck. It was a perfect afternoon, and no sooner had I cleared the belt of scrub which grew round the kraal, when by the aid of my glasses I saw a herd of zebra and other game away in the distance, feeding peacefully on the rolling prairie. I made my way steadily towards them, and noticed as I went that a couple of eland were gradually drawing away from the rest of the herd. I marked these for my own, carefully noting the direction in which they were taking. I dismounted and made a detour round a rise so as to lie in wait for them and cut them off. My plan succeeded admirably, for the two fine animals continued to come straight towards me without suspicion, feeding quietly, by the way. When they got to within 80 yards or so, I picked out the bigger head and was only waiting for him to make a slight turn before pulling the trigger, when bang went the heavy rifle of one of my companions about a half-mile away. In an instant, the two eland had bounded off, and I decided not to risk a shot, in the hope that they would soon settle down again and give me another chance. Mentally blessing my friend for firing at this untimely moment, I watched them make for a belt of wood about a mile further on, hoping against hope that they would remain on the near side of it. No such luck, however, for they plunged into it and were quickly swallowed up out of my sight. Running to my pony, which Landalu had dexterously brought up, I galloped in the direction of the spot in the trees where the eland had disappeared, but imagine my vexation when I found that I had to pull up sharp on the edge of a nasty-looking swamp, which at first sight appeared too boggy and treacherous to attempt to cross. I rode up and down it without being able to find anything like a really safe crossing place, so in desperation I at last determined to take the risk of crossing it along an old rhino path where the reeds were flattened down. My pony floundered bravely through and eventually succeeded in getting safely to the other side. I then made my way cautiously through the bolt of trees and was relieved to find that it was only half a mile or so broad. I dismounted as I neared the further side, and tying my pony to a tree, crept quietly forward, expecting to see the eland not far off. But to my disappointment, there was no trace of game or any kind on the whole wide stretch of country that met my view. I therefore tried another direction, and taking a half turn to my left, made my way carefully through some open glades to the top of a little rise not far off. The sight that now met my eyes fairly took my breath away, for there, not 300 yards off and stalking placidly along at a slow walk, was a herd of fully 100 eland of all ages and sizes. The rear of the column was brought up by a magnificent old bull, and my heart jumped for joy as I watched him from the shelter of the bushes which I lay concealed. The next thing to be done was to decide on a plan of attack, and this had to be thought of without loss of time, for the wind was blowing from me almost in the direction of the eland, who would certainly scent me very soon if I did not get away. Quickly noting the direction in which they were moving, I saw that if all went well, they ought to pass close to a little hillock about a mile or so off, and if I were very sharp about it, I thought I could make a circuit through the wood and be on this rise in a good position for both wind and cover before the herd could reach it. Accordingly, I crept away with the object of finding my mount, but to my delight, and just behind me and well hidden, stood the undefeated Landalu, who in some mysterious way had followed me up, found the pony where I left it tied to a tree, and brought it to me. With a bright grin on his face, he thrust the reins into my hand, and I was up and galloping off in an instant. I soon discovered that I had further to go than I expected, for I was forced to make a big detour in order to keep out of sight of the herd. But on halting once or twice and peeping through the trees, I saw that all was going well, and that they were still calmly moving on in the right direction. The last quarter of a mile had to be negotiated in the open, but I found that by lying flat down on my pony's back, I was completely hidden from the advancing herd by an intervening swell in the ground. In this manner I managed to get unobserved to the lee of my hillock, where I dismounted, threw the reins over a stump, and crawled stealthily but as quickly as I could to the top. I was in great doubt as to whether I should be in time or not, but on peering hatless over the crest, I was overjoyed to find the whole herd just below me. One of the eland, not 20 yards off, saw me at once and stood still to gaze at me in astonishment. It was a female, however, so I took no notice of her, but looked round to see if my great bull were anywhere near. Yes, there he was. He had passed the spot where I lay, but was not more than 40 yards off, moving in the same leisurely fashion as when I first saw him. An instant later he noticed the general alarm caused by my appearance, and stopped and turned half round to see what was the matter. This gave me my opportunity, so I fired, aiming behind the shoulder. The way in which he jumped and kicked on feeling the lead told me I had hit him hard, but I got 2 more bullets into him from the magazine of my .30-03 before he managed to gain the shelter of a neighboring thicket and was lost to sight. In the meantime, the whole herd had thundered off at a full gallop, disappearing in a few minutes in a cloud of dust. I was confident that there would be little difficulty in finding the wounded eland, and on Landalu coming up, which, by the way, he did almost immediately, for he was a wonderful goer, we started to make a rough search through the thicket. Owing to the growing darkness, however, we met with no success, so I decided to return to camp, which was many miles away, and to resume the quest at daybreak the following morning. It had turned out that we were even further from home than I thought. the black night came upon us before we had covered a quarter of the distance. Fortunately, the invaluable Landalu had discovered a good crossing over the swamp, so we were able to press on at a good pace without losing any time in overcoming the obstacle. After an hour or so of hard traveling, we were delighted to see a rocket go up, fired by my friends to guide us on our way. Such a sight is wonderfully cheering when one is far away from camp, trudging along in the inky darkness and none too certain of one's direction, and a rocket equipment should invariably be carried by the traveler in the wilds. Several more were sent up before we got anywhere near camp, and I remarked to Landalo that we must have gone a very long way after the eland. "Long way," he replied. "Why, master? We have been to Baringo." This lake, as a matter of fact, was fully 50 miles away. When finally we arrived, I fired the ardor of my companions by relating the adventures of the afternoon and telling them of the wonderful herd I had seen, and it was at once agreed that we should stay where we were for a day or two in the hope of good sport being obtained. As soon as it was daylight the next morning, I sent out a party of our porters with full instructions where to find my eland, which I was sure must be lying somewhere in the thicket close to the hill from where I had shot him, and very shortly afterwards we ourselves made a start. After a couple of hours traveling, we were lucky enough to catch sight of a portion of the herd of eland when we dismounted and stalked them carefully through the long grass. All of a sudden one popped up its head unexpectedly about 50 yards away. One of my companions immediately leveled his rifle at it, but from where I was I could see better than he that the head was a poor one, and so called out to him not to fire. The warning came too late, however, for at that moment he pulled the trigger. It was rather a difficult shot, too, as the body of the animal could not be seen very well, owing to the height of the grass. Still, as the head instantly disappeared, we hoped for the best and ran up to the place, but no trace of the eland could be found. Accordingly, we pushed on again, and after a little, rested for a short time under the shade of some trees. We had gone about 3 miles after resuming our search for game, when one of the porters remembered that he had left the water bottle he was carrying at the trees where we had halted, so he was sent back for it with strict injunctions to make haste and rejoin us as quickly as possible. Curiously enough, this trifling incident proved quite providential, for the porter, whose name was Sabaki, after recovering the water bottle, found himself unable to trace us through the jungle and accordingly struck home for camp. On his way back, he actually stumbled over the dead body of the eland which I had shot the previous day, and which the search party had sent out in the morning had failed to find. They were still looking for it close at hand, however, so Sabaki held them, and they at once set to work to skin and cut up the animal, and then carried it to the camp. Meanwhile, of course, we knew nothing of all this, and continued our hunt for game. Shortly after noon, we had a light lunch, and while we were eating it, our guides, Uliagurna and Landalu, discovered a bee's nest in a fallen tree and proceeded to try to extract the honey, of which the Maasai are very fond. This interference was naturally strongly resented by the bees, and soon the semi-naked youths ran flying past us with the angry swarm in full pursuit. I laughed heartily at Landalu, and chafed him unmercifully for allowing himself, a Maasai, to be put to flight by a few bees. The jolly fellow took very good-humoredly, saying that if he had only had a jacket like mine, he would soon go and get the honey. So after taking some photographs of our guides at work among the bees, we all proceeded homewards, reaching camp about dusk with nothing to show for our long day's hunt. We were met by Sabaki, who was in a great state of excitement, and who started to explain in very bad Swahili how he had come across the dead eland. Misunderstanding what he said, I told my friend that Sabaki had found the eland which he had shot in the morning, and rejoiced heartily with him at this piece of good luck. On viewing the head, however, we could not understand it, as it was very much bigger than the one he had fired at. And it was not till later in the evening, when I visited Landalu curled up in the campfire, that the mystery was explained. He greeted me by saying that after we had all gone to Baringo for nothing the previous day, and on my asking him what he meant, he told me about the finding of the eland, taking it for granted I knew it was mine. I quickly called up Sabaki, and after some trouble, got from him the whole story of how he had found the body close to my little hillock, and near where my men were searching for it. So I broke the truth gently to my friend, who at once acknowledged my claim, and congratulated me on my good fortune. How great this good fortune was I did not know till long after, but even then, when I came to examine the head and skin carefully, I found that they both differed materially from those of any other eland that I had ever seen. For one thing, there was no long tuft of hair on the forehead, from while the the lower corner of each eye ran an incomplete white stripe similar to and smaller than those found in the giant eland. The sides of the forehead were of a reddish color, and on the lower part of the face there was a much larger brown patch than is to be seen on the ordinary eland. The striping of the body was very slight, and the chief markings being 3 lines across the withers. On my return to England in April, I sent the head to Roland Ward's to be set up, and while there it was seen by Mr. R. Lydecker, FRS, of the British Museum, the well-known naturalist and specialist in big game, who wrote to tell me that it possessed great zoological interest, as showing the existence of a hitherto unknown race of eland. Mr. Lydecker also contributed the following notice describing the animal to the Field of September 29th, 1906. Quote, considerable interest attaches to the head of an eland killed by Colonel J. H. Patterson in Portuguese East Africa and set up by Mr. Roland Ward on account of certain peculiarities in coloring and markings, which indicate a transition from the ordinary South African animal in the direction of the great eland, Tarotragus derbianus, of the Bahar el Ghazal district in West Africa. In the striped variety, Tarotragus oryx livingstonianus, of the ordinary South African eland, the whole middle line of the face of the adult bull is uniformly dark, or even blackish-brown, with a tuft of long, bushy hair on the forehead, and no right stripe from the lower angle of the eye. On the other hand, in the Sudani form of the giant eland, T. derbianus gigas, as represented by a bull figured by Mr. Rothschild in Novitiates Zoologicae for 1905, the upper part of the face has the hair rufous and shorter than in the ordinary eland, while from the lower angle of each eye a white stripe runs inwards and downwards, recalling the white chevron of the kudu, although the 2 stripes do not meet in the middle line. In Colonel Patterson's eland, which may well be designated T. oryx pattersonianus, there is an incomplete white chevron similar to, although smaller than, the one found to the giant eland, while only a narrow stripe in the middle of the line of the face above and between the eyes is a dark brown, the sides of the forehead being rufous. On the lower part of the face there is a large dark brown area than in the ordinary eland, and although there is a rufous fawn-colored patch on each side above the nostril. In both the latter respects, Colonel Patterson's specimen recalls the giant eland, although it apparently lacks the dark white border band on the side of the neck, characteristic of the latter. If all the elands from that part of Portuguese East Africa where Colonel Patterson's specimen was obtained turn out to be of the same type, there will be a strong presumption that the true and giant eland, like the various local forms of giraffe and Bonte quagga, are only races of one and the same species. While, even if the present specimen be only a sport, which I consider unlikely, it will serve to show that the southern and northern elands are more nearly related than has hitherto been supposed. As my eland thus proved to be of some considerable scientific value, and as the authorities of the British Museum expressed a desire to possess its head, I gladly presented it to the trustees, so that all sportsmen and naturalists might have an opportunity of seeing it at the Natural History Museum at South Kensington, where it now is. The end.